It was the biggest ship ever built in its time, and it was supposed to be unsinkable. But within days of steaming out on its first voyage in 1912, the Titanic was gone beneath the relentless waves of the North Atlantic Ocean. And of its more than 2,200 passengers and crew, only 706 survived that dreadful night. Would a smaller ship have fared any better in the same situation? Did the size of the iceberg truly matter in the end? Was it a mistake for the ship to change course at the last minute as it tried to avoid impact? These are three questions that have people pondering, what if? We do know that Titanic was considered an engineering marvel in its day. Designed by Thomas Andrews for the British shipping company White Star Line, it was just over 880 feet long and 175 feet tall. Built with abundant space for 840 staterooms, a swimming pool, a squash court, a gym, and 2 dining rooms. But it was below deck that one of its most impressive new features could be found. Titanic's hull was divided into 16 compartments designed to be watertight. Up to 4 of these compartments could take on water in the event of a breach, with the remaining 12 helping to keep the damaged ship afloat. It was thanks to these compartments that the ship was regarded as unsinkable. Rumor has it that Philip Frank, White Star Line's vice president, even declared, "There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." On April 14, 1912, that proved to be mistaken when Titanic struck an iceberg. As ice ripped along the ship's hull, several of those watertight compartments ruptured. It took only 2.5 hours for Titanic to sink. Did the size of the iceberg that hit Titanic seal its fate? Would a bigger or smaller iceberg have made any difference? Icebergs come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. They are pieces of ice that have broken away from glaciers or ice shelves in the Arctic and Antarctic, and are now wandering across the ocean until they eventually melt. One of the tallest icebergs ever found would have easily dwarfed Titanic. Discovered in 1957, it was 550 feet high. That's close to the height of the Washington Monument. Imagine ramming into something that big. Smaller icebergs, though, can turn out just as dangerous. Some are the size of houses and called bergy bits. Others, closer to the size of a car, are called growlers. These can be much harder for ships and boats to locate, making them more difficult to avoid. And, though smaller, they can produce a lot of damage when hit. It's also critical to recall that icebergs are always bigger than they seem, with the majority of their mass lurking below the ocean surface. In fact, over 80% of an iceberg's volume is underwater. Most of its sharp, jagged edges cannot be seen. Roam too close, and you risk damaging your ship's hull. Because Titanic had little notice of its impending doom, a smaller iceberg, struck at the same angle, could still have been enough to bring that mighty ship down. Now, it's possible that had the iceberg been larger, it would have been spotted sooner. Titanic might have had time to alter course and avoid the impact. But missing that one iceberg would not have guaranteed Titanic's safety. It was traveling in a dangerous stretch of the Atlantic called Iceberg Alley. It's located 250 miles east and southeast of Newfoundland, Canada. Behind one iceberg, there could be another, and another after that. And so the crew on board had to remain very attentive to avoid several potential collisions, not just one. A smaller ship might have been better suited for the trip. Titanic's size was certainly a challenge when it came to steering. In fact, it had just left her dock in Southampton when it nearly collided with another smaller ocean liner, the SS New York, missing it by just 2 feet. The gigantic steamship was obviously not made for maneuvering quickly in tight quarters. A ship that size required time and space to change course. But when it comes to ships versus icebergs, a ship's size doesn't always matter. The Islander was a steamship designed to travel the Inside Passage in Alaska. In the summer of 1901, it struck an iceberg, which tore a hole in the front portion or bow of the ship. The vessel did not sink right away, and the crew tried to steer it to safety. Ultimately, its bow completely submerged, and its stern was lifted up and out of the water. It didn't take much longer before the ship sank completely. Of the 168 passengers and crew members, 128 survived, and $3 million in gold was lost. Islander had a 240-foot hull, making it almost a quarter of the size of Titanic, and that smaller size didn't seem to be much help in preventing a collision with an iceberg. And then there was the Hans Hedtoft in 1959. Also known as the Little Titanic or the Danish Titanic, it was referred to as the safest ship afloat. It was 272 feet long, with 95 people on board. Much like the real Titanic, the Hans Hedtoft was specifically engineered to handle most of what the sea could throw its way. Along with its double steel bottom, it also had an armored bow and 7 watertight compartments. How could such a ship sink? But it could, and it did. It was on its first voyage, returning to Copenhagen, when it ran into trouble. On January 30th, it hit an iceberg. An SOS was sent, but when the Johannes Cross arrived to help, the Hans Hedtoft was nowhere to be found. The only evidence of the ship's existence was a lifebelt that was washed ashore in Iceland 9 months later. Again, the ship's smaller size didn't work in its favor. A smaller size of Titanic wouldn't have guaranteed a safe voyage in 1912. The final what-if concerns the last-minute choice when the iceberg was spotted and the alarm sounded. First, Titanic could attempt a complete stop, but this wasn't an option as the ship needed a half a mile to come to a halt, and the iceberg was a mere 900 feet away. Second, the Titanic could attempt to avoid the iceberg by steering away from it. This is what the captain ordered, but the attempt was unsuccessful, resulting in a deep gash across the ship's hull. The final option? To hit the iceberg head-on. Would this have made any difference? The answer is an intriguing maybe. Some think a head-on collision would have saved Titanic. In this scenario, the collision would have limited the damage to the very front of the ship, instead of the iceberg tearing through the hull and compromising several of the watertight compartments. Only 4 of the compartments would have been breached. This meant the others could do their job of keeping Titanic afloat. The ship could be stuck, unable to move, but it would remain above water until help arrived. This would provide a ship like Carpathia enough time to reach the scene of the accident and bring the people on board to safety. One of the Titanic's designers, Edward Wilding, made a similar claim during an inquiry into the sinking. He argued that most people would have survived a head-on crash, and that Titanic itself would not have sunk. Others disagree, though. First, the special bulkheads on Titanic were designed specifically to protect the ship against collisions with other vessels, not with icebergs. These compartments would crumple upon impact, absorbing some of the force while the other ship absorbed the rest. Though the damage would still be extensive, the remaining bulkheads would keep the ship afloat. But an iceberg does not have the same flex in a collision as you would experience with another ship. Most of the force would be absorbed by Titanic, resulting in greater damage to the ship. Even worse, the impact would be carried through the full length of the ship. Rivets would burst, seams would tear, the compartments would quickly flood, and the ship would sink even faster, resulting in fewer survivors. In any case, as with most what-ifs, we'll never really know the answer. As tragic as Titanic's first and last voyage was, it did result in changes that helped make venturing out to sea much safer. Findings from hearings on the disaster led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, or ICC, in 1914, an organization that tracks icebergs in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans to ensure vessels in the area can avoid them. In the US and Britain, ships were obligated to carry enough lifeboats to accommodate every person aboard. Regular lifeboat drills were made mandatory. And finally, the bulkheads on ships were made higher to keep water out, and bottoms were stretched to create double hulls, helping make the compartments truly waterproof. There's no denying that Titanic was a terrible tragedy, but the lessons learned from that night to remember has helped prevent many more.
John watched on in disbelief as he drifted away on a piece of wood. In the freezing waters of the Arctic, slowly drifting away. John looked upon the vessel he had worked and lived on as it raised its enormous bow high into the sky, then broke in half, causing a sound that only a crack of lightning could replicate. Distraught and dumbstruck, believing that he, and he alone, knew the dark truth behind the demise of the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. 5 days earlier, as the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, John worked hard alongside his mates in the coal bunker, stocking up the coal to feed the Titanic's mighty furnace. They had stocked and stored more than John had ever witnessed on any other ship he'd worked on. But this was the Titanic, the grandest ship to have ever sailed the seas. On the Titanic, there could never be too much coal. As they left Belfast and pushed toward Southampton, there was a large bang below decks that went unnoticed. The furnace was roaring and the turbines were spinning, pushing the Titanic forward at a quickened pace. The crew cheered as the vessel moved forward, unaware of the loud, concerning noise. Arriving in Southampton, Greg came aboard, amongst hundreds of other passengers. With 13 years at sea, his vast experience included the role as a quartermaster on 6 previous ships. Ready for a new challenge aboard the greatest vessel ever made, he was looking forward to this next challenge of his career. Greg came with a wealth of experience, especially with sailing through the Arctic. His role was vital within the crew, understanding the seas around the North Pole. He would be a key lookout as they set to cross the perilous path of the Iceberg Alley. Greg had some concerns regarding the voyage. The Earth's orbit was remarkably close to the sun and the moon, causing higher tides. This would make icebergs more prominent, drifting them further away and towards the route of the Titanic as they journeyed to New York. Assessing the lookout tower and inspecting the available gear, Greg found no binoculars. This made him concerned, but the sailors just laughed at Greg. "If the deck is short on ice cubes, we'll be sure to plow right through a berg to resupply." A sailor laughed. Greg didn't share this sentiment. Eager to find out why they had been left short-handed on equipment, since he had such a vital role on the ship, Greg inquired further. Sadly, the officer with the keys to the binocular supply cupboard had been removed from the crew at the last minute. Greg couldn't believe something of this importance had been overlooked. For such a mighty ship with so many people aboard and crossing in a particularly perilous path, this just didn't make sense. But not wanting to be fined for breaking into the ship's property, Greg let it slide, hoping that they wouldn't need the binoculars in the end. Ultimately, if there were icebergs expected, a warning call would be made to the captain, informing of any concerns. Little did Greg know that a warning had been received, notifying of the dangers that awaited. But the telegram didn't provide the required prefix, which would have ensured direct delivery to the captain. So, the critical warning was just overlooked. John and his crew below decks prepared for departure, stoking the engines. He noticed an essence of thick exhaust, far too heavy than what would be expected from the furnaces. The crew searched throughout the lower decks. Following a thorough search, they managed to locate the cause of the exhaust. It was an ignited pile of coal within a coal bunker. Unknown when it had ignited, a buildup of coal had clearly been smoldering, slowly growing in size. The amount of smoldering coal was concerning. The alarm was raised, alerting an officer to review the matter. The officer assessed the damage and confirmed with the captain that it was deemed to be of little concern, as only minor damage had been caused. John was unsure of this assessment, as he knew that in confined spaces, surrounded by iron bulkheads, an oven-like environment arises that intensifies the heat with time. But the Titanic would power forward, making no sense to John as they had only just departed from Southampton. He was sure they would have turned back. John and his crew were ordered to shovel the already lit coal into the furnace and continue shoveling until all the smoldering contents would be contained. It was a possible but painstaking task that could take the entire journey. The continuous intake of coal would ensure the turbines would spin at a constant, accelerated pace, not what the Titanic was designed for. It was meant to be a luxurious passenger liner and not for breaking speed records. However, the crew would find enthusiasm in not only acknowledging the Titanic as unsinkable, but also as the fastest. John and his crew continued to shovel the coal into the furnace for several days. The temperature within the bow was becoming hotter every day. The bulkhead's contained heat was so severe that it became weak at the seams in the iron walls and rivets.
2 more days, lads, just 2 more days.
John was laughing, trying to raise the spirits of his mates as they were working tirelessly. But as they were all laughing, joking, and looking forward to dry land, they unknowingly approached their final destination. The Titanic was speeding through the calm sea. Greg looked ahead, above in the lookout tower, keeping a keen eye out as they were in iceberg territory now. Even though the way seemed clear, false horizons could occur, creating confusion about how far objects in the distance truly were. As they were traveling in the Gulf Stream waters into the colder Labrador Current, air columns cooled from the bottom upwards, creating a thermal inversion. This incredibly high air pressure ensured fog wasn't present, providing a deceptively clear outlook. But the thermal inversion can also create optical illusions, showing the horizon further away, appearing higher in the distance, or masking whatever objects that could come before it. These false horizons could easily hide any icebergs that could be approaching. Greg knew the perils of a calm sea in the Arctic, preferring the rough waters, where it's easier to detect icebergs within waves. Peering from the lookout, Greg was looking towards the dark abyss ahead. Suddenly, within 1 mile directly in front, a formidable image quickly emerged from the dark waters surrounding.
Iceberg, right ahead!
Greg yelled to his mate, who quickly called to the helm and directed them to steer hard to starboard. The helmsman received the call. In the heat of the moment, he turned the wheel counterclockwise. He then realized he'd turned the wheel the wrong way and quickly went in the opposite direction. The ship aimed towards the iceberg, veering to the port side whilst reducing speed. Although there was a delay in turning the wheel, since there was a short distance from the signal and the fast pace that they sailed at, it may not have made a difference. As they approached the iceberg, it appeared as though they'd miss it, but over 87% of an iceberg is underwater. And as they came along the side, the hidden ice underneath hit the port side bow, piercing the side of the hull with a 12-square-foot tear. The ship shook, with all aboard aware that something was amiss. Amongst the confusion and fear, they were oblivious of the damage. As they gathered their bearings, 6 out of 16 compartments were quickly filling up with seawater. The hull could only withstand 4 compartments filling before sinking. Time was ticking as the Titanic made its descent into the depths. The weakened bulkhead with heated steel pillars and rivets broke under the pressure and sudden change of temperature from the ice-cold water. The call was made to abandon the ship. Lifeboats were prepared to be released, while help signals were sent out to nearby ships. The radio operator was guiltily sitting, constantly calling out to a nearby ship that had been in contact with the Titanic recently. There was steady communication with this ship over the past few days, providing warnings of icebergs since the Titanic departed from Southampton. The final warning message received was just 1 hour ago. Upon receiving the final warning, the operator ignorantly responded, "Shut up," with the assumption that their warnings of icebergs were pointless. Following this unfortunate response, the ship turned their radio off and provided radio silence. The closest ship that was responding to their distress signals was 500 miles away, too far to provide any assistance in time. There were countless mistakes that caused the Titanic's watery end, whether they contributed directly or from sheer ignorance. The most tragic of them was the number of people aboard the ship, 2,224 of them. There were only enough lifeboats provided to rescue 1,178, barely half of the people. Can you guess how many theories of the Titanic's sinking exist? Right, loads, including a theory of my own, which I'm going to share with you today. And then you can decide which one seems most likely to you. One Piece theory. The very first version of the events was the One Piece theory. It's very simple and basically claims that the sinking happened without any breakups. 2:15 a.m., the ship collides with an iceberg. 2:18 a.m., the lights go out. The ship reaches an angle of 45 degrees and then quickly begins its final plunge into the ocean depths. 2:20 a.m., only about 3 minutes later, the RMS Titanic disappears under the surface of the ocean for good. The liner doesn't break, it just goes down as a whole piece. Of course, this can't be true. In April 1912, the Titanic was not only the largest ship in the world, but also the largest ship ever built. It's hard to believe that such a heavy vessel could have gone down without breaking. That's just impossible. Well, I mean, you can't blame the theorists. Before we found the wreckage, there were no other theories. Wait a minute, or were there? The day after the disaster, the survivors gave their interviews. They talked about what had happened, and some of them claimed that the ship had actually broken in two when it had been flooded. For example, Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old boy, outlined the sinking as he remembered it, and L.D. Skidmon drew a sketch based on his description. The picture clearly showed the ship breaking in half. But no one believed Jack or other witnesses. There was no evidence, so their claims were received with a grain of salt. But in 1985, things changed. First, breakup theory. That's when Robert Ballard found the wreckage of the Titanic in the depths of the ocean. When people saw the wreckage, it became clear that Jack and the other survivors had been right. The Titanic did indeed break in two when it sank. So it's time for a new theory. 2:15 a.m. The keel breaks, the starboard list eases, and the hull continues to bow and crumble. 2:17 a.m. The galley sections break off. The towers immediately drop under their own weight. The lights go out. The stern is pulled into the air. The bow breaks off and starts sinking. The aft is barely hanging on to the starboard side of the stern section superstructure. The stern section slowly lists over to port as it begins sinking again. It rises up one last time and pivots in a semicircle as it sinks. It all sounds pretty convincing, right? But people began to find plot holes in this theory. For example, the Titanic couldn't have held together until it reached such a high angle. The breakup would have had to begin much earlier. This only meant there was still a vast field for research and speculations. So people started to come up with their own possible scenarios. How about we look first at the ones no one likes? V-brake and Aaron 1912 V-brake. According to the first breakup theory, the Titanic reached a high angle, and the weight of its unsupported stern caused it to crack from the top down. But it's physically impossible. So, are there any other ideas? In 2006, Roger Long, a naval architect, decided to research a so-called V theory. 2:17 a.m. The breakup begins at a shallow angle, perhaps as little as 11 degrees. The upper structure fails and starts to crack. At this moment, only its double bottom is holding the Titanic together, but it starts to bend under the strain too, failing the ship. Water is pouring through the crack. It increases the weight in between the two sections, bending the Titanic the other way and pulling it into shape somewhat resemblant to the letter V. The upper decks get mangled and bent together. The bow heads for the bottom, and the stern is the last to sink. This theory has since been disproven many times, though. Roger Long believed it because the broken edges of the upper decks in the Titanic's bow section were all mangled and crushed. However, we have learned that it happened because of the so-called hydraulic downburst, the force of the water crashing into the deck as the Titanic hit the ocean floor. Another V-brake theory states that the bow had risen out of the water after the break. This theory was mainly peddled by one former Titanic enthusiast. But not only has this theory been proved to be physically impossible due to the bow's incredible mass, it was also inspired by incorrect information. Remember Jack Thayer? Well, it was based on his sketch and the words of a couple of passengers. But the truth is, none of them had ever seen the Titanic break down like this. Jack himself even stated in an interview that the sketch was completely out of context to what he had actually seen. It was drawn by a passenger on the Carpathia, the ship that received the Titanic's distress signal and came to its aid. It couldn't be used as evidence. Now that we know this, let's move on to the theories that most people believe in. James Cameron's banana peel theory. Who hasn't seen the legendary movie about the Titanic, right? It became the leader of the 70th Academy Awards ceremony in the number of nominations and awards, and deservedly so. But did you know that James Cameron had been interested in the Titanic for many years and studied the ship's history? His books and research are very detailed, and he even came up with his own version of the events. It's called the banana split theory, and this is actually what you could see in the movie. Here's how it goes. The Titanic reaches a 23-degree angle and fractures down to the keel. The double bottom acts as a hinge as the stern falls down. When the double bottom fails, the bow and the stern separate. The stern lists to port, standing vertically, and then begins to go underwater. This theory is the most scientifically accurate one, along with Roy Mengat's theory. Wait, who's Roy Mengat? Mengat theory. Roy Mengat was an engineer who came up with the most plausible theory for the time being. 2:17 a.m. The lights go out on the Titanic. At this moment, the ship is at an angle of 20 to 23 degrees. Suddenly, the vessel snaps in two just around the third funnel. It causes the stern to settle into the water. The keel fails first. The draft and lower hull are crushed and break apart. Water surges into the bow and stern of the ship through the huge cracks, causing the bow section to sink beneath the waves. The stern rises up to the angle of 70 to 90 degrees, and then it sinks too. This theory seems to make the most sense, but it's quite controversial. The survivors who saw the breakup stated that the stern had settled back with the bow completely missing. Mengat's theory, however, contradicts that statement, while James Cameron's scenario takes this into account. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The truth must be somewhere in the middle. My version. Now, as promised, I'll provide you with my version of the events. Well, it's not really my theory, more like a combination of Roy Mengat's and James Cameron's ones. I believe that James Cameron was right about the breakup. 2:17 a.m. The ship is at a high angle. The lights go out. Then it snaps into two pieces. The bow starts sinking. The double bottom is still attached to the stern for a minute or so. Once the double bottom fails, the two parts separate and the bow goes down. Then, as Mengat said, the stern rises up at a high angle, and then it begins to sink vertically. It might have actually happened because the survivors stated that they had seen a clean break. This means it couldn't be hidden. And they had also seen the stern staying vertically in the air for a long enough time, probably a few minutes, before disappearing. Anyways, all of these are just speculations. Regardless of how the Titanic broke apart and sank, it was a great tragedy. It's already been 110 years since the Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank. Did you know that in 2022, the Blue Star Line Company is completing the construction of an exact replica of the Titanic? Called the Titanic II liner, the ship will be sent sailing along the same route with 2,400 people on board. Let's hope that everything goes well for them.
April 14, 1912. The dark night was filled with horrible sounds of a giant metal vessel breaking into two. The largest ship of that time collided with an iceberg that was on its way. The Titanic, one of the biggest stories of the 20th century that people still talk about. The starboard side of the giant vessel brushed up against the iceberg. It was 11:40 p.m. when things started going wrong. This iceberg caused enough damage for at least 5 watertight compartments in the hull to start filling with water. The crew immediately began a brief investigation to see if they could do anything and fix things. They had no one to rely on, all alone in the darkness of the cold night, far away from the land. the North Atlantic Ocean, around 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. They needed time to figure out how to bring people to safety. They had some time, true, but not enough. If you watched the movie, you know the ship didn't plunge immediately after the icy doom had happened. The whole process lasted a good 2 hours and 40 minutes. But the situation was hard. There were 2,200 people to take care of, including crew and passengers, and things happening on the ship were chaotic. The chief designer, Thomas Andrews, soon realized they wouldn't be able to stay afloat. By midnight, the entire crew had begun preparing the lifeboats for launch. They had 20 boats with space for only 1,178 people, which was just a bit more than 50% of the people on board. The order was to get women and children to safety first. Crewmen were there to row and guide the boats. The scene over the next 2 hours gradually started escalating. The crew members had a task to wake up passengers and warn them something bad was happening. They wanted to place them into a fleet of lifeboats as soon as possible. At 12:15 a.m., some crew members sent out a distress signal. A steamship called Frankfurt was among the first ones that received the message and responded, but they were about 170 nautical miles away. Some other ships also got the message and offered their assistance, but sadly, they were too far away as well. At 12:20 a.m., the Cunard liner Carpathia got a distress signal from the Titanic and changed its course right away. They were 58 miles away at the time, and it would take them more than 3 hours to get there. 20 minutes later, the crew was lowering the first lifeboat. It was carrying only 27 passengers, although it had room for 65. Many of the lifeboats that were launched first were well below capacity. Crew members were worried, thinking the Davids wouldn't be able to hold a fully loaded lifeboat. And in the beginning, many passengers were just too afraid to leave the ship. They still thought Titanic was unsinkable and couldn't imagine the scenario that was going to happen 1 to 2 hours later. The crew was firing the first of 8 distress rockets. Unsuccessful. No one was close enough to help. By 1:20 a.m., they lowered 10 lifeboats. Number 8 had only 28 people in it. One of the passengers on the number 10 was 9-week-old Melvina Dean. She would later become the last survivor who lived until 2009 and turned 97. It was 2 a.m. already. 3 of the collapsible boats were the only lifeboats that remained on the ship. The bow of the vessel had sunk low and had tipped far under the surface. People around it could now clearly see stern propellers above the water. Crew members were lowering collapsible lifeboat D from the roof of the officers' quarters with over 20 passengers in it. As the ship's bow went under, the water was washing collapsible A from the deck. Those 20 people were struggling because their boat was partly filled with water. As crew members were trying to release collapsible B, it fell. Before they righted it, the water swept it off the ship. 30 passengers still managed to find safety on the overturned lifeboat. At 2:17 a.m., the ship's wireless operator decided to transmit one last distress call. A minute later, the light on the ship finally went out. Titanic and all left on board plunged into darkness. The bow continued to sink, and the stern was rising higher above the surface, which placed great strain on the midsection. Horrible sounds were filling the night. Titanic, this massive, legendary ship so many people placed their hopes in and were excited about, broke into 2 between the 3rd and 4th funnels. Reports would speculate it took about 6 minutes for the bow section to reach the ocean bottom. The stern settled back in the water before it rose again into a vertical position. It remained in this situation until it finally disappeared into the ocean. At 2:20 a.m., the stern apparently retained air inside, and water pressure crushed it as it went down. The stern landed about 2,000 feet away from the bow. People consider the Titanic the fastest ship in the world. They thought it was unsinkable because 4 of its compartments could be flooded, and that still wouldn't cause a critical loss of buoyancy. Its life was problematic since its beginning. While the ship was leaving port, it moved within a couple of feet of the steamer New York. It managed to safely pass by, which was a huge relief for all those worried passengers massed on the ship's decks. Titanic sailed off on the 10th of April. Its first journey was across the highly competitive Atlantic route. On the launch day, the Titanic became the biggest movable object in the history of humankind, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide. Not that big if you compare it with today's ships. The biggest cruise ship in the world today is Royal Caribbean's Symphony of the Seas, which is roughly 5 times the size of Titanic. If you put that ship in a vertical position, it would be nearly as tall as the Empire State Building, which is 1,250 feet without antennas. But Titanic was a huge attraction back in its time. At one moment of their journey, they stopped in France, after which they made another stop in Ireland. Once the final passengers boarded, the massive ship set out at full speed for their final destination, New York City. 4 days after the beginning of its journey, Titanic failed to divert its course from a huge iceberg, the story we all know about. Only 700 people survived, and most of them were women and children. The night was extremely cold, 1 hour and 20 minutes after Titanic had gone down to the bottom of the ocean. Survivors weren't even sure someone was coming to save them. Finally, they saw the light. It was Carpathia coming towards them. They came for the people in the lifeboats. The crew brought them aboard and pulled a handful of other passengers out of the water. Many ships tried to contact Titanic a few hours after it sank. Their messages were never returned. Later, when there was an investigation of what really happened, they discovered the Leyland liner California had been less than 20 miles away when Titanic was sinking. But the crew didn't hear the distress signals coming from Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Countries from both sides of the Atlantic were shocked and horrified when they heard details of what happened to Titanic. They decided to make changes to ship operations, rules that would help avoid such events in the future. They held the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, where they adopted rules for every ship to have lifeboat space for each passenger on board. Also, lifeboat drills became mandatory. They also decided to establish an international ice patrol. Its main role was to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships also needed to maintain a 24-hour radio watch. Titanic wasn't built alone. Because of the size of this magnificent ship and all the new equipment it required, it would have been too expensive as a one-off. So the team built the Titanic alongside 2 sister ships, and both of them had eventful lifetimes. RMS Olympic came first. It was launched in 1910, and for a whole year was the biggest liner in the world. The Britannic was another sister ship that sailed for a while before it too ended down on the ocean bottom. But only Titanic became a legend and one of the most fascinating stories of modern history.
Meet Arthur John Priest. No, he isn't famous for being a painter or for discovering some long-lost treasure. He didn't invent some cool gadget or break any world records. No, Arthur John Priest is famous simply for being unsinkable. Proving one can be both lucky and unlucky at the same time, Priest was involved in and survived several mishaps at sea, including the fateful maiden voyage of the Titanic. Priest was not a rich man interested in sailing for pleasure. He was part of the working class, employed as a stoker or fireman, stuck for hours within the hot bowels of large steam-powered vessels. His job was dirty and difficult. He was responsible for keeping the furnaces lit, feeding them coal to ensure enough steam was produced for the engines to work. He had to be careful about not overheating the system or setting fire to the whole ship. The furnaces had to be carefully watched and constantly fed. He breathed it all in a while, working and fighting with the sweat and the dirt. He would often work shirtless because of the heat and was always covered in black coal dust. And when he finally had a break, his shared living quarters were nearby in the same part of the ship. He must have been good at his job, though, because he had no trouble finding work. But wherever he went, bad luck seemed to follow. The first incident was a mild one. As a young man, Priest worked on the RMS Asturias. The passenger liner first set sail in 1907, traveling between Southampton in the UK to Buenos Aires in Argentina. At some point during its maiden voyage, the ship suffered a small collision. The damage was bad enough that the ship returned for repairs. Thankfully, there were no reports of any serious injuries. Priest, unfazed, simply went to work on another ship, but his bad luck lingered on the Asturias. In 1914, the Asturias became a hospital ship, helping care for sick men and women around Europe while bringing them home to England. But in March 1917, at just around midnight, the ship was struck by a foreign object. Its hull was breached and the engine room flooded. The captain ordered everyone to abandon the ship, sending crew, patients, and health staff scrambling for the lifeboats. The vessel was still moving, powering through the water because the main controls, located within the flooded engine room, could not be turned off. The captain refused to leave the ship while people were still trying to escape. He was able to aim the Asturias towards Bolt Head, where it finally hit land and couldn't sink. The remaining lifeboats were lowered and the final survivors made it to safety. When they studied the damage on the ship later, the Asturias was declared a total write-off. It might be hard to pin this particular disaster on Priest. After all, he wasn't even on the ship at the time. But it seemed that many of the ships on which he served were destined for trouble. His bad luck followed him to his next job on the RMS Olympic, a massive ocean liner. The Olympic was big. In fact, it had been designed and built as part of the fleet that included the Titanic. But with size came sacrifice. The Olympic was great at moving in one direction, but very difficult to handle when it needed to turn. It was September 1911. The Olympic was trying to alter its course. The Hawk, a smaller ship sailing nearby, didn't give the larger vessel enough room to maneuver, and the two slammed into each other. Because the Hawk was engineered to deal with potential confrontations when out at sea, its reinforced bow tore through the Olympic. Two large gashes appeared on the ocean liner's side. The propeller shaft was badly twisted, and worse, the ship began to take on water. Somehow, the Olympic made it to shore without sinking, and nobody was seriously hurt. Priest had no idea that this was just a small taste of what his future held for him. He next found employment on a brand new ship, a better ship, an unsinkable marvel that was said to be the biggest vessel to have ever been built. Yes, he was going to work on the Titanic. And what a job! It took 29 boilers, requiring 850 tons of coal a day to produce enough steam to power the Titanic. Priest was just one of 150 stokers toiling away in the ship's underbelly, keeping those fires burning day and night. He made around $30 a month. But on April 14, 1912, he would find himself flung from a world of extreme heat to one of blistering cold. At approximately 11:35 p.m., the crew spotted an iceberg. The Titanic tried to avoid it, but the alarm had been sounded too late. 5 minutes later, the two collided. The iceberg tore through the hull, and the once watertight compartments inside were badly ruptured. As the cold Atlantic water flooded in, the ship began to sink. Distress signals were sent, but the closest ship, the Carpathia, was over 3 hours away. In the dark of night and stuck in the middle of nowhere, the crew and passengers panicked. Those who could scrambled for the lifeboats. Others jumped into the icy waters. In total, only 706 survived that terrible night. Priest, at the time of the collision, was down in the ship's lower quarters. He was on break, relaxing from a hard day of work. And as the ship went down, so did his chances of survival. He and his fellow workers were in the most dangerous position on the ship. They had to make their way through a maze of corridors and gangways, some of which were flooded, in a mad dash to the deck. And then they faced the frigid water, jumping in and desperately swimming to safety. The ocean was so cold that Priest even suffered frostbite before finding his way onto a lifeboat. He was one of only 44 stokers to survive that night. After an experience like that, most of us would never set foot on a boat again. But Priest had to work. His next job also ended in disaster. He was offered employment on the HMS Alcantara. It went down in 1916, and Priest was again one of the few to make it to safety. He was badly wounded in the process. But he kept pressing his luck, and his next job as a stoker may have felt eerily familiar. He would be working on a ship built by the same people behind both the Olympic and the Titanic. And this ship, named the Britannic, was the biggest of the three. It was also believed to be a superior vessel, fitted with new safety features after the Titanic sank. For example, it had 48 open lifeboats, 46 of which were the largest ever used on a ship before. 2 of these were even motorized and equipped with special communication devices. The good news? The Britannic survived its first trip without incident. It was already doing better than the Titanic ever did. However, on November 21st, 1916, the Britannic was shaken by a loud explosion while traveling through the key channel in the Aegean Sea. The hull was damaged, and some of the compartments began to fill with water. But, unlike the Titanic, the Britannic had been designed for just such an emergency. It had been fitted with 5 watertight bulkheads. Intact, these would help keep the ship safe and floating for a much longer period of time. But there was one issue. Portholes along the lower decks had foolishly been left open. As the ship tilted, the portholes let in water, which flooded the Britannic and hastened its descent into the sea. This effectively made those watertight bulkheads useless. The ship was going down fast, much faster, in fact, than the Titanic had sunk. 35 of the lifeboats were successfully launched, saving most on board. Of the 1,066 passengers and crew, 1,036 survived. Priest, his luck intact, was one of them. And yet, he still wasn't done with a life at sea. He accepted a position as a stoker on the Donegal. It was a smaller passenger ferry that had been converted for use as a hospital boat. In April 1917, it was struck by a foreign object while fleeing an unsafe situation, and though he suffered from a head injury, Priest was again one of the survivors. It took experiencing 2 collisions and 4 sinkings before Priest was finally ready to retire. In fact, he reportedly said he only gave it up because no one wanted to sail with him. Can you blame them? He would live out the rest of his life on dry land in Southampton, England, with his wife Annie and their 3 sons. But Arthur John Priest would always be remembered as the unsinkable stoker.
John watched on in disbelief as he drifted away on a piece of wood.
In the freezing waters of the Arctic, slowly drifting away. John looked upon the vessel he had worked and lived on as it raised its enormous bow high into the sky, then broke in half, causing a sound that only a crack of lightning could replicate. Distraught and dumbstruck, believing that he, and he alone, knew the dark truth behind the demise of the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. 5 days earlier, as the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, John worked hard alongside his mates in the coal bunker, stocking up the coal to feed the Titanic's mighty furnace. They had stocked and stored more than John had ever witnessed on any other ship he'd worked on. But this was the Titanic, the grandest ship to have ever sailed the seas. On the Titanic, there could never be too much coal. As they left Belfast and pushed toward Southampton, there was a large bang below decks that went unnoticed. The furnace was roaring and the turbines were spinning, pushing the Titanic forward at a quickened pace. The crew cheered as the vessel moved forward, unaware of the loud, concerning noise. Arriving in Southampton, Greg came aboard, amongst hundreds of other passengers. With 13 years at sea, his vast experience included the role as a quartermaster on 6 previous ships. Ready for a new challenge aboard the greatest vessel ever made, he was looking forward to this next challenge of his career. Greg came with a wealth of experience, especially with sailing through the Arctic. His role was vital within the crew, understanding the seas around the North Pole. He would be a key lookout as they set to cross the perilous path of the iceberg alley. Greg had some concerns regarding the voyage. The Earth's orbit was remarkably close to the sun and the moon, causing higher tides. This would make icebergs more prominent, drifting them further away and towards the route of the Titanic as they journeyed to New York. Assessing the lookout tower and inspecting the available gear, Greg found no binoculars. This made him concerned, but the sailors just laughed at Greg.
If the deck is short on ice cubes, we'll be sure to plow right through a berg to resupply.
A sailor laughed. Greg didn't share this sentiment. Eager to find out why they had been left short-handed on equipment, since he had such a vital role on the ship, Greg inquired further. Sadly, the officer with the keys to the binocular supply cupboard had been removed from the crew at the last minute. Greg couldn't believe something of this importance had been overlooked. For such a mighty ship with so many people aboard and crossing in a particularly perilous path, this just didn't make sense. But not wanting to be fined for breaking into the ship's property, Greg let it slide, hoping that they wouldn't need the binoculars in the end. Ultimately, if there were icebergs expected, a warning call would be made to the captain, informing of any concerns. Little did Greg know that a warning had been received, notifying of the dangers that awaited. But the telegram didn't provide the required prefix, which would have ensured direct delivery to the captain. So, the critical warning was just overlooked. John and his crew below decks prepared for departure, stoking the engines. He noticed an essence of thick exhaust, far too heavy than what would be expected from the furnaces. The crew searched throughout the lower decks. Following a thorough search, they managed to locate the cause of the exhaust. It was an ignited pile of coal within a coal bunker. Unknown when it had ignited, a buildup of coal had clearly been smoldering, slowly growing in size. The amount of smoldering coal was concerning. The alarm was raised, alerting an officer to review the matter. The officer assessed the damage and confirmed with the captain that it was deemed to be of little concern, as only minor damage had been caused. John was unsure of this assessment, as he knew that in confined spaces, surrounded by iron bulkheads, an oven-like environment arises that intensifies the heat with time. But the Titanic would power forward, making no sense to John as they had only just departed from Southampton. He was sure they would have turned back. John and his crew were ordered to shovel the already lit coal into the furnace and continue shoveling until all the smoldering contents would be contained. It was a possible but painstaking task that could take the entire journey. The continuous intake of coal would ensure the turbines would spin at a constant accelerated pace, not what the Titanic was designed for. It was meant to be a luxurious passenger liner and not for breaking speed records. However, the crew would find enthusiasm in not only acknowledging the Titanic as unsinkable, but also as the fastest. John and his crew continued to shovel the coal into the furnace for several days. The temperature within the bow was becoming hotter every day. The bulkhead's contained heat was so severe that it became weak at the seams in the iron walls and rivets.
2 more days, lads, just 2 more days.
John was laughing, trying to raise the spirits of his mates as they were working tirelessly. But as they were all laughing, joking, and looking forward to dry land, they unknowingly approached their final destination. The Titanic was speeding through the calm sea. Greg looked ahead, above in the lookout tower, keeping a keen eye out as they were in iceberg territory now. Even though the way seemed clear, false horizons could occur, creating confusion about how far objects in the distance truly were. As they were traveling in the Gulf Stream waters into the colder Labrador Current, air columns cooled from the bottom upwards, creating a thermal inversion. This incredibly high air pressure ensured fog wasn't present, providing a deceptively clear outlook. But the thermal inversion can also create optical illusions, showing the horizon further away, appearing higher in the distance, or masking whatever objects that could come before it. These false horizons could easily hide any icebergs that could be approaching. Greg knew the perils of a calm sea in the Arctic, preferring the rough waters, where it's easier to detect icebergs within waves. Peering from the lookout, Greg was looking towards the dark abyss ahead. Suddenly, within 1 mile directly in front, a formidable image quickly emerged from the dark waters surrounding.
Iceberg, right ahead!
Greg yelled to his mate, who quickly called to the helm and directed them to steer hard to starboard. The helmsman received the call. In the heat of the moment, he turned the wheel counterclockwise. He then realized he'd turned the wheel the wrong way and quickly went in the opposite direction. The ship aimed towards the iceberg, veering to the port side whilst reducing speed. Although there was a delay in turning the wheel, since there was a short distance from the signal and the fast pace that they sailed at, it may not have made a difference. As they approached the iceberg, it appeared as though they'd miss it, but over 87% of an iceberg is underwater. And as they came along the side, the hidden ice underneath hit the port side bow, piercing the side of the hull with a 12-square-foot tear. The ship shook, with all aboard aware that something was amiss. Amongst the confusion and fear, they were oblivious of the damage. As they gathered their bearings, 6 out of 16 compartments were quickly filling up with seawater. The hull could only withstand 4 compartments filling before sinking. Time was ticking as the Titanic made its descent into the depths. The weakened bulkhead with heated steel pillars and rivets broke under the pressure and sudden change of temperature from the ice-cold water. The call was made to abandon the ship. Lifeboats were prepared to be released, while help signals were sent out to nearby ships. The radio operator was guiltily sitting, constantly calling out to a nearby ship that had been in contact with the Titanic recently. There was steady communication with this ship over the past few days, providing warnings of icebergs since the Titanic departed from Southampton. The final warning message received was just 1 hour ago. Upon receiving the final warning, the operator ignorantly responded, "Shut up," with the assumption that their warnings of icebergs were pointless. Following this unfortunate response, the ship turned their radio off and provided radio silence. The closest ship that was responding to their distress signals was 500 miles away, too far to provide any assistance in time. There were countless mistakes that caused the Titanic's watery end, whether they contributed directly or from sheer ignorance. The most tragic of them was the number of people aboard the ship, 2,224 of them. There were only enough lifeboats provided to rescue 1,178, barely half of the people.
We've heard so much information about this terrible tragedy that happened on the night of April 14, 1912. What really caused the disaster? Could the Titanic passengers have been saved? Was the ship cursed? All these questions still remain unanswered. So this time, let's not focus on the tragic side of the event, but on the fantastic stories of people who miraculously managed to survive that day and what happened to them in the future. As you know, when Titanic crashed into the iceberg, the ship's crew first evacuated the women and children. But among the passengers, one woman remained on the sunken vessel and survived after it went underwater. Her name was Rhoda Abbott. She and her 2 sons lived in England and had been living there for 2 years before they decided to return home to Providence, Rhode Island. Rhoda bought 3 third-class tickets for the most modern and unsinkable ship of that time. The whole family slept in their cabin on that ominous night from April 14th to 15th. They didn't feel the jolt and got up only after the steward knocked on the door. He asked them to wear life jackets and go to the upper deck. Then, along with other third-class passengers, they waited in line to board the lifeboats. The crew members allowed only women and little kids to go further. Still, the brothers negotiated with the team and walked their mother to the lifeboat. All 3 went to the last lifeboat, but the crew asked the sons to leave since not all the women had been evacuated. Rhoda didn't want to leave her sons, so she decided to stay with them. She left the boat and hugged the boys. By this time, the ship was sinking into a stern-up position. The deck tilted. Rhoda tried to hold her sons but couldn't. She slapped off the deck and fell into the icy water. From there, she swam to the lifeboat that was washed away from the deck. Rhoda climbed aboard and watched the Titanic go under the water. Unfortunately, she was unable to save her 2 sons. Besides her, there were 13 people in the boat. But in the end, no one except Rhoda survived. A few hours later, the ship Carpathia arrived and found a nearly frozen Rhoda in the boat. The vessel arrived almost 3 days later in New York, where Rhoda was hospitalized, and she lay there for about 2 weeks. Swimming in cold water caused her asthma, which remained with her for life. Later, she admitted that she hadn't regretted that she had refused to evacuate with other women because she got a little extra time to spend with her sons that night. Another survivor of Titanic was Violet Jessup. She boarded the ship not as a passenger, but as a working staff. She was hired by the White Star Line, which was looking for people to serve wealthy clients on the new luxury liner. And on April 10th, after an interview, Violet boarded the Titanic. The first days of work went as usual, but then the ship crashed into an iceberg. In the beginning, no one panicked and didn't even want to believe that the unsinkable boat could go down. But while the people on the upper deck were having these conversations, water flooded the ship's hold. Violet, along with other stewards, helped people evacuate. One of the ship's commanders ordered Violet to get into the boat first to show everyone else it was safe. She obeyed and spent several hours there until rescuers came for the survivors. But the most exciting thing in this story was that before the Titanic, Violet had already been in another shipwreck. The ship where she worked as a steward collided with another vessel at sea. All the people were saved, and Violet got a job on the Titanic a few years later. But even after the famous shipwreck, she didn't change her profession and went to the Britannic Floating Hospital. And you know what? It also sank. Violet managed to survive for the third time, but this didn't scare the girl. After all these events, she continued her work on other ships. She survived 3 shipwrecks and got a name for this, Miss Unsinkable. One of the bravest passengers of the Titanic was the ship's chief baker, Charles Jogan. On the night of April 14th, he woke up after the collision with the iceberg. During the few hours as the ship was sinking underwater, Charles helped the passengers. First, he ordered his bakers to supply all rescue boats with food, then helped the crew evacuate the passengers. He was one of the last people left on the ship when all rescue boats were on the water. But still, he continued to save people's lives. Charles started to throw deck chairs overboard so people could hold on to them. Then, when half of the Titanic went down, he lowered into the icy water, where he noticed a capsized rescue boat. Charles boarded it and waited a few hours until rescuers appeared. And the most incredible thing is that he was completely fine when the Carpathia arrived and found him. He had not even a scratch and wasn't at all hypothermic. Among the Titanic's surviving passengers was Margaret Brown, known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She was visiting a friend in England with her daughter, but when Margaret found out her grandson was ill, she immediately bought a ticket to New York on board the Titanic. After colliding with the iceberg, Margaret bravely helped people evacuate until the stewards forced her to get into a boat. She continued to help other passengers until they were rescued by the Carpathia. Margaret created a survivors committee and raised about $10,000. At that time, it was quite a lot of money. For many years, she protected and supported the Titanic's passengers, who were in poor financial condition. Margaret also helped to build the Titanic Memorial in Washington. A wealthy English businessman, J. Bruce Ismay, was on board the Titanic, and the shipwreck was not the only disaster for him. He managed to jump into the last boat 20 minutes before Titanic was completely submerged. Thus, he saved his life but condemned himself to eternal contempt. When he was on the mainland, the newspapers began to write about him as the main coward of the Titanic. Also, some articles accused him of sinking the ship. Ismay was a White Star Line company director that created the ship. And according to newspaper articles, the businessman asked the captain to sail faster. He wanted the ship to arrive in America ahead of schedule and receive good reviews in the press. As a result, the ship crashed into the iceberg at high speed and damaged the hull. Nobody proved the businessman's guilt. Almost all of the criticism of Bruce Ismay was concentrated in one newspaper. Its publisher had a fight with the businessman before the tragedy, so they decided to destroy his reputation. Britain organized an independent investigation, which concluded that Ismay did nothing wrong. Yeah, he jumped into the last boat, but only after all the women and children were evacuated. However, the investigation didn't help to clear his reputation. In England and America, many friends and colleagues turned away from him. For many years, Ismay compensated the families who lost someone on the Titanic. The most famous passengers of the Titanic were an orchestra of 8 musicians. In the beginning, there was no panic when the ship collided with the iceberg. Many refused to get into the boats, as it seemed to them that it was safer on the Titanic. Others were sure the breakdown on the ship would soon be repaired. Some people didn't believe the ship could sink. A minor panic began when everyone realized a catastrophe was imminent. To calm the people down a bit, the 8 musicians from 2 ensembles started playing music. Survivors said the orchestra played until the very end. Fear for their lives and the nearness of the end didn't confuse the valiant men. Unfortunately, they didn't survive, but a memory about them was written in history forever, and their musical instruments became world-famous artifacts and very valuable items at auctions.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, Lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered, just like in the movie. Women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for 2 reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like Lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, The 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray.
It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, they were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph's uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidor started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidor and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidor didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting. April 14, 1912. A cold evening somewhere in the North Atlantic. On board the most modern and unsinkable ship, the Titanic, a dinner is held. 2 well-dressed men are sitting at one of the tables. One of them is a famous British journalist. He tells his interlocutor an interesting and at the same time terrible story. It all started about 1000 BCE in ancient Egypt. At that time, one woman was born in the city of Thebes. No one knew who she was or what she did, but she had a high social standing. Towards the end of her life, she was proclaimed a priestess in the College of Amen-Ra. Her body was embalmed, placed in a wooden casket, and covered with a massive lid bearing the image of a woman and mysterious inscriptions. She was buried in Thebes along with other people of the upper class. The mummy of this woman lay at rest for almost 3,000 years. The burial place had been carefully hidden. Around the first half of the 19th century, a group of locals accidentally discovered the ancient tomb. They disturbed the peace of the priestess. No one knows exactly what happened that day, but the mummy was removed from the casket and disappeared without a trace. A few decades later, a group of 4 wealthy friends from England came to Egypt for a trip across the upper part of the Nile. First, they went to visit the excavations of the Temple of Amen-Ra near the city of Luxor. There, they found the empty mummy case. It depicted the priestess with dark eyes looking into the void. There was something sinister in her gaze. They didn't know who the case belonged to, but they were so amazed by the beauty and energy of that find that they decided to buy it from the locals. The buyer disappeared the same night before the case was delivered to him at the hotel. Some said they'd seen the man leave the hotel and go towards the desert. No one knew why he did it. No one else saw him afterwards. Another man from the same group took the casket. During their return home, one of the friends was seriously injured. After arriving in London, the new case owner discovered the bank where all his money was placed had gone bankrupt. In one day, the man turned from a wealthy businessman into a beggar. A third friend also experienced the sinister influence of the ancient find. He lost his health, job, and eventually even his life in an accident shortly after returning to London. Before going bankrupt, the owner gave the ancient casket to his sister who lived in London. One of the friends of this woman came into the room, saw the Egyptian artifact, and immediately felt the dangerous energy emanating from it. Then the owner's sister gave the case to a famous photographer. He took some photos and was horrified. According to his words, he saw a real priestess with a human face in the photos. She looked at him with an ominous, icy gaze. No one except the photographer touched the film of the camera. No one changed the photo. Shortly after, the photographer mysteriously went missing. From that point, the story becomes vague. According to one version, the owner's sister gave the artifact to the British Museum. The man who transported the case passed away soon after, and his assistant got into a terrible accident. Another version says that the item from the Egyptian tomb was bought by a rich businessman. After that, 3 members of his family also had an accident, and his house burned down. Convinced the mummy case was cursed, he gave it to the British Museum. The interlocutor listens to the story with such interest that he forgot about dinner, which has gone cold. "How did you know all this?" he asks. The journalist replies he has been studying everything related to the mummy and its owners for several months. He found evidence of all the accidents and put together the full picture. "So, what happened next?" the interlocutor asks. It seems the mummy case should find peace in the museum. The priestess was surrounded by other kings and queens from different times. However, there was no peace. Scientists and ancient languages experts tried to decipher the symbols on the case. They found out that most of the inscriptions meant curses and misfortunes addressed to those who'd dare to disturb the peace of the priestess. Every night, the guards and museum staff heard the knocking coming from the mummy case. The knocking was accompanied by crying and screaming. Also, someone scattered other exhibits all over the hall every night. Everyone soon came to believe that the priestess's spirit continued to use magic forces. Then, one private collector became interested in the case. He bought it from the museum, not for his collection, but to try to expel the spirit of the mummy from the artifact. It's not known in what ways he tried to do this, but he failed. Then, he managed to sell the mummy case to a rich American archaeologist. That guy decided to move the mummy to New York. And what? What happened next? The interlocutor asks with interest. "That's it. End of story," the journalist answers. "What do you mean? What happened to the mummy? Where is it now?" The journalist looks at the interlocutor with some excitement. "She's here. She's on the Titanic," he says. The interlocutor looks scared and confused, but the journalist confirms the sarcophagus is here. He doesn't doubt it because he saw it with his own eyes. After dinner, they go to their cabins. The journalist lies down, but can't help thinking about the mummy. He tries to convince himself that everything he has found out about the priestess is a myth. There is no curse. The moment he finally falls asleep, he feels a slight push. A few minutes later, a crew member knocks on his cabin door. He informs that all passengers must go to the upper deck because something has happened to the ship. The journalist goes out into the fresh air and sees a huge crowd of people. There's no panic yet. Someone says that something has happened to the engine. Others say it's just a precaution. The journalist immediately understands everything. The ship is sinking. The priestess did it. In less than an hour, the Titanic completely went underwater. One legend says the priestess influenced the captain of the ship. The crew members didn't dare to put such a valuable cargo in the hold. Therefore, they placed the box with the artifact near the captain's bridge. On that fateful night, the captain decided to look at the casket with his own eyes. After that, his behavior became weird. They said the spirit clouded his mind. When the ship entered the territory filled with icebergs, he refused to slow down, despite the requests of the crew. The sarcophagus may still lie at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean even now, with the priestess finally having found her peace. Okay, this story is nothing more than a legend. There's no record or evidence that the Titanic was carrying any kind of mummy or sarcophagus. The legend appeared a couple of years after the disaster. At that time, there were many theories about what happened to the Titanic. The ship sank because of secret agencies. ETs attacked the Titanic. The Titanic was sunk specifically to get money for the insurance company. Such crazy theories were very popular among audiences. One of these theories was developed by a well-known newspaper. Journalists published an article about the cursed mummy on board the Titanic. The rest picked up the legend, and it became popular. One of the reasons why people believe in such things is hidden in human psychology. Any fake legend tells something secret, things that people don't or shouldn't know about. When a person reads this, they feel special because now they know a terrible secret. This sense of self-importance is the reason for the popularity of conspiracy theories. Well, it is also important to note that all these theories are really interesting. By the way, the mummy from this story actually exists, and it's in the British Museum. More precisely, there's only a wooden lid from the sarcophagus with the image of a woman. It's still unknown who it belonged to. The identity of the last owner is also unknown. It's only known the exhibit was transferred to the museum at the end of the 19th century. There, she was called the Unlucky Mummy. The museum staff reports that it doesn't bring any misfortunes. The screams and knocking from the lid are just a myth. You can come and see the exhibit yourself with your own eyes, if you dare, of course.
It's April 10th, 1912, a sunny spring day. You're one of the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic, just as the ship is about to depart from Southampton. Imagine everyone's excitement, fresh spring air, the sounds of the sea. You're strolling along the highest deck of the Titanic when you notice several lifeboats. As you start counting the boats, you recall the ship's capacity. It's just over 3,000 people. Wait, but are there enough lifeboats for everyone aboard? Let's look into the numbers. The Titanic could carry a needed total of 64 lifeboats, a number which could have easily helped to save all the passengers on board. Chief designer Alexander Carlisle planned to equip the ship with 48 lifeboats, but the Titanic ended up with a mere 20. The fact that this number of lifeboats wasn't enough for all the passengers was not illegal at the time. This was because the number of lifeboats required was calculated based on the tonnage of a ship, not her passenger capacity. Speaking of the Titanic, this number of boats was chosen for aesthetic reasons, to make the decks look less crowded to the ship's elite and high-class passengers. After the final decision on the lifeboats was taken, Carlisle quit his job. Passengers' strolls on the Titanic's decks were pleasing to the eye, but were they worth it in the end? In 2012, a century after the wreck, new documents related to the scandalous lack of lifeboats were uncovered. It appears that a safety inspector named Maurice Clark proposed the addition of at least 10 more lifeboats, 5 hours before the ship was supposed to set sail. But since the ship's owners clearly wanted to leave on time, his plea was overlooked. He was also warned that unless he kept this secret, he would be fired. In retrospect, had the owners followed his advice, an estimated 700 more people might have survived that night. The 20 lifeboats you counted, those that actually made it on board, could have carried only a third of the passengers, even at their full capacity. But tragically, some of them were launched with as few as 12 people when they could have easily saved up to 65 people each. To add to the disaster, the Titanic's crew members were not properly trained on using the lifeboat launching equipment. That's why the boats were launched slowly, improperly, and sometimes without the right supervision. Out of the 20 lifeboats, only 18 were set afloat correctly. Also, passengers were not informed about safety measures. A lifeboat drill should have taken place on the 14th of April, but the captain eventually canceled the event. One of the many myths surrounding the Titanic and its catastrophic ending is also related to the lack of the necessary number of lifeboats. There was no maritime law at the time that said women and children should get into lifeboats first, but it was a universally accepted custom in such types of situations as a shipwreck. Shortly after the Titanic had sunk in the icy Atlantic waters, rumors started to spread. It was said that some desperate men had resorted to dressing up as women in those final moments before midnight on April 14, 1912. They wanted to get a spot on the lifeboats and have a chance to save their lives. At the same time, there's little to no evidence that any of the male passengers of the Titanic had actually done this. In any case, what happened to those 20 lifeboats that were on board the Titanic after the ship hit the iceberg? What we do know is that all these boats were launched between 12:40 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. with a total of 718 people on board. By the time they were rescued by the RMS Carpathia at about 4 a.m. the same day, only 705 people had remained alive. It took the crew of the RMS Carpathia more than 4 hours and 30 minutes to pick up all the passengers and 13 of the lifeboats. This was as many as the rescue ship was allowed to carry. The rest of the now empty lifeboats were left adrift at sea. Those salvaged were later given back to the White Star Line, the British shipping company which operated the Titanic. Strangely, after being returned, they appeared to have vanished from official records. The last image ever taken of the 13 surviving lifeboats was of them getting unloaded in the New York harbor. Sadly and ironically, that's where the Titanic was supposed to be on April 18, 1912. The lifeboats were then rid of their Titanic nameplates or any other markings that could have linked them to the ship. Some sources claim that the boats were eventually destroyed. But was this actually the truth? The fate of one particular lifeboat has been the source of much debate. Collapsible Boat A, the last one to leave the ship, was retrieved by the RMS Oceanic a month after the crash. At that time, it was a shocking 200 miles away from the spot where the Titanic had sunk. Also, in the boat, there was a wedding band engraved with the words "Edward to Gerda," a sad omen to a couple that were lost at sea after managing to escape the sinking Titanic. Later identified as Edward and Gerda Lindell, the couple was traveling from Sweden to the US to relocate. Some accounts claimed that Mr. Lindell did, in fact, make it to Collapsible Boat A, but his wife wasn't as lucky. Neither were ever seen again, and the wedding band was eventually sent to Gerda's father. The recovery of Collapsible Boat A was recorded in both photographs taken by the crew on board the RMS Oceanic and by a detailed handwritten account of a fellow passenger. They claimed that the lifeboat had looked more like a piece of wood carried by the waves than an actual boat. The first lifeboat to depart from the Titanic was Lifeboat number 7. It was dubbed the Millionaire Lifeboat. It's rumored that the 12 passengers on board might have bribed the crew to row away to safety instead of allowing others to jump in. In 2015, some of the items recovered from this lifeboat, including a lunch menu, a ticket, and a letter from one of the passengers, were auctioned for up to $70,000 by a New York auctioneer. Soon after the Titanic catastrophe, it became mandatory for all ships to be equipped with enough lifeboats to carry all the passengers and crew. It's more likely that the Titanic lifeboats, being relatively new equipment at the time, were refitted to be used on other ships, such as the RMS Olympic, which was the Titanic's older sister. Some of them may have been sold off to private collections, or even left to rot. After all, they were seen as a source of bad luck, and most people were unwilling to use them again on other ships. Unfortunately, all the information about their whereabouts is hard to confirm now. No official statement from the owners of the lifeboats was ever given after their rescue. But although nothing appears to have remained of the original lifeboats, some full-sized replicas exist on display in museums in Falmouth, England, and Belfast, Northern Ireland. One of the few surviving White Star Line lifeboats did not, in fact, belong to the Titanic, but it did have a striking connection to the cursed ship. This boat is the restored Lifeboat 6 from the RMS Oceanic, which helped to recover Titanic's collapsible Lifeboat C. It was said to be owned by a private collector, but similar to the Titanic's lifeboats, we don't know anything about its location today. As for the nameplates and other identification marks of the lifeboats, the White Star Line seems to have kept them. Because some of these items were later auctioned and sold to interested collectors, even Rick Springfield supposedly got hold of one of the nameplates. One particular nameplate was already missing by the time the White Star Line employees had reached the lifeboats. It was the nameplate of Lifeboat Number 8, which had been taken by a sailor named Thomas Jones. He later gifted it to another Titanic survivor, the Countess of Rothes, along with a letter acknowledging the bond they formed on the night of the shipwreck. You can find other similar items on display in different museums, such as Larne Museum and Arts Centre in Northern Ireland, or Worcester City Art Gallery and Museum. To be fair, some experts claim that even if there had been more lifeboats on board the Titanic, there simply might not have been enough time to launch them all. That's how severe the impact was. Many researchers say that everything was happening so rapidly after the ship had hit the iceberg that it's astonishing that so many passengers managed to survive.
On April 10, 1912, crowds gathered at Southampton Beach to wave off what was, at the time, the world's largest and most prestigious ship, the RMS Titanic. The cost of the most expensive first-class parlor ticket was $4,350. That's around $70,000 in today's money. But barely 5 days after steaming away, the ship was swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean. So let's rewind and go back to what actually happened on that fateful night. The captain wanted to set a speed record for the ship's maiden voyage and arrive early. The ship was deemed unsinkable, so he went full throttle into the dark Arctic waters. After spotting the 100-foot iceberg, the crew desperately tried to steer the vessel away and avoid the collision, but the Titanic was traveling too fast, and the iceberg tore down the side of the ship, creating a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. In total, the damage spanned along an area of around 300 feet. But the ship's designers had prepared for the prospect of a collision and added watertight compartments down each side of the ship to act as a buffer zone. 4 of these compartments could be breached and the ship would still stay afloat. But because the iceberg tore down the side of the Titanic, it ripped holes in 6 compartments. The compartments didn't extend up the total height of all decks and weren't actually sealed at the top. This is why, when more than 4 were flooded, water reached over the top of the bulkheads and filled the remaining compartments, causing the ship to sink into the ocean. Think of it as water spilling over an ice cube tray. But what if the collision was head-on? Would it still have sunk? Ships are designed with potential crashes in mind, and most vessels have collision bulkheads in the bow. Most of all, it's like your car's bumper or crumple zone. It's a safety feature that can withstand a direct hit. The bow could have taken some of the impact, and some experts have suggested that if it hit head-on, only 2 to 4 of the watertight compartments would have been flooded. So, in theory, the Titanic might not have sunk, and it might have even been able to continue sailing to its final destination at a much slower speed. The force of impact would likely have been huge, though. But although passengers would have been injured by the force, they'd have been able to stay on the ship to wait to be rescued by other ships, rather than being forced into the icy waters of the Atlantic. Still, one of the Titanic's designers, Edward Wilding, suggested that the force of the impact might not have actually been that big. He told the British Inquiry that lots of people scarcely felt the collision, and he believed the ship would not have sunk if it did hit the iceberg head-on. The ship was also designed with remotely operated watertight doors between all compartments, so any floods could have been quickly sorted out. Because Titanic had 6 breaches from the side collision, and because it happened so quickly, sealing the doors wouldn't have made a difference, as it was essentially impossible to save it by that point. The ship immediately began to flood, with water pouring in at a rate of roughly 7 tons per second, 15 times faster than it could be pumped out. So, while it sounds like the Titanic would have survived had the ship hit the iceberg head-on, this idea does come with some issues. First off, the collision bulkheads were designed to survive a crash with another ship, not a giant iceberg. If 2 ships collided, both would absorb some of the impact in their bulkheads, sharing the impact and likely staying afloat. But an iceberg is stationary, meaning that Titanic would absorb most of the energy from the collision. If Titanic hit head first, because of the speed it was traveling, the impact would have likely traveled down the whole body of the ship. Just imagine a 46,000-ton ship traveling at around 20 knots. At some point, it hits an iceberg that weighs what could be over 100,000 tons. This collision would likely create a powerful force causing massive damage to the vessel. It is likely that seams would split, staircases would come tumbling down, and rivets would burst open across the ship. All that would have potentially flooded even more compartments. This could have caused Titanic to sink in a matter of minutes rather than hours. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. As we all know, the biggest part of it is hidden underwater. So if Titanic had been traveling head-on, it's likely it would have hit the part of the iceberg below the water first, which would send it veering off course. Hitting an iceberg is not like hitting a brick wall. In this case, the ice under the water would have torn open the bottom of the ship and caused damage to the sides. Icebergs also aren't flat, solid objects. If a flat collision happened, the ship might have stayed afloat, but icebergs come in many shapes and sizes, from domes to wedges. Studies have also been done on the steel used to produce Titanic, and the tests show the metal was about 10 times more brittle than the steel we use today. The ship was built before we understood the effects of low temperature on steel. The old steel used to make the vessel would not bend when faced with freezing temperatures, but break. Recovered pieces of Titanic's hull plates show that the hull just shattered on impact. Hitting head-on would also cause a very severe and abrupt stop, so even if the ship hadn't sunk, there would still have been major issues. Think about when you suddenly hit the brakes on your car, or when the bus stops while you're walking down the aisle and you get flung forward. Passengers would have been thrown across the ship, and because the crash happened at night, most people were sleeping, so wouldn't be able to effectively prepare for any sort of impact. This would result in injuries for most people on board. It would be especially bad for those at the front of the ship, where the accommodation for the off-duty firefighters, greasers, and engineers was. But while passengers and off-duty crew may have been thrown out of bed, there would be a lot more survivors than in the original scenario. Many ships have had head-on collisions and made it back to shore. Not many people know that Titanic actually had 2 sister ships. The White Star Line, the company that built Titanic, also built vessels called Britannic and Olympic. Captained by Edward J. Smith, who would later helm Titanic, the Olympic set off on its maiden voyage in June 1911. But much like for its sister ship, disaster was just around the corner. On its 5th commercial voyage, Olympic collided with a Royal Navy ship, HMS Hawke. While the Olympic received damage to its side, Hawke crashed into the other vessel head-on. The bow of the Hawke was completely crushed by the collision, but because the ship had watertight compartments, it managed to survive the impact and later returned to shore for repair. Another study case is the SS Andrea Doria, which was an Italian ocean liner that made global headlines in 1956. Like the Titanic, the Andrea Doria was heading for New York City on its 101st voyage when disaster struck. On July 25th, the vessel collided with the 524-foot Swedish passenger liner Stockholm. The Stockholm hit the ship head-on, but the point of impact for the Andrea Doria was on its side. The front of the Stockholm was completely smashed, but because the impact was on its hull, it managed to survive. The Andrea Doria, however, sadly sank due to the collision being on the side of the ship. So these cases could suggest that maybe the Titanic would have survived had it hit the iceberg head-on. But we have to remember that the Titanic hit the thing full speed, whereas both the Olympic and the Andrea Doria were traveling slower.
John watched on in disbelief as he drifted away on a piece of wood. In the freezing waters of the Arctic, slowly drifting away. John looked upon the vessel he had worked and lived on as it raised its enormous bow high into the sky, then broke in half, causing a sound that only a crack of lightning could replicate. Distraught and dumbstruck, believing that he, and he alone, knew the dark truth behind the demise of the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. 5 days earlier, as the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, John worked hard alongside his mates in the coal bunker, stocking up the coal to feed the Titanic's mighty furnace. They had stocked and stored more than John had ever witnessed on any other ship he'd worked on. But this was the Titanic, the grandest ship to have ever sailed the seas. On the Titanic, there could never be too much coal. As they left Belfast and pushed toward Southampton, there was a large bang below decks that went unnoticed. The furnace was roaring and the turbines were spinning, pushing the Titanic forward at a quickened pace. The crew cheered as the vessel moved forward, unaware of the loud, concerning noise. Arriving in Southampton, Greg came aboard, amongst hundreds of other passengers. With 13 years at sea, his vast experience included the role as a quartermaster on 6 previous ships. Ready for a new challenge aboard the greatest vessel ever made, he was looking forward to this next challenge of his career. Greg came with a wealth of experience, especially with sailing through the Arctic. His role was vital within the crew, understanding the seas around the North Pole. He would be a key lookout as they set to cross the perilous path of the Iceberg Alley. Greg had some concerns regarding the voyage. The Earth's orbit was remarkably close to the Sun and the Moon, causing higher tides. This would make icebergs more prominent, drifting them further away and towards the route of the Titanic as they journeyed to New York. Assessing the lookout tower and inspecting the available gear, Greg found no binoculars. This made him concerned, but the sailors just laughed at Greg.
If the deck is short on ice cubes, we'll be sure to plow right through a berg to resupply.
A sailor laughed. Greg didn't share this sentiment. Eager to find out why they had been left short-handed on equipment, since he had such a vital role on the ship, Greg inquired further. Sadly, the officer with the keys to the binocular supply cupboard had been removed from the crew at the last minute. Greg couldn't believe something of this importance had been overlooked. For such a mighty ship with so many people aboard and crossing in a particularly perilous path, this just didn't make sense. But not wanting to be fined for breaking into the ship's property, Greg let it slide, hoping that they wouldn't need the binoculars in the end. Ultimately, if there were icebergs expected, a warning call would be made to the captain, informing of any concerns. Little did Greg know that a warning had been received, notifying of the dangers that awaited. But the telegram didn't provide the required prefix, which would have ensured direct delivery to the captain. So, the critical warning was just overlooked. John and his crew below decks prepared for departure, stoking the engines. He noticed an essence of thick exhaust, far too heavy than what would be expected from the furnaces. The crew searched throughout the lower decks. Following a thorough search, they managed to locate the cause of the exhaust. It was an ignited pile of coal within a coal bunker. Unknown when it had ignited, a buildup of coal had clearly been smoldering, slowly growing in size. The amount of smoldering coal was concerning. The alarm was raised, alerting an officer to review the matter. The officer assessed the damage and confirmed with the captain that it was deemed to be of little concern, as only minor damage had been caused. John was unsure of this assessment, as he knew that in confined spaces, surrounded by iron bulkheads, an oven-like environment arises that intensifies the heat with time. But the Titanic would power forward, making no sense to John as they had only just departed from Southampton. He was sure they would have turned back. John and his crew were ordered to shovel the already lit coal into the furnace, and continue shoveling until all the smoldering contents would be contained. It was a possible but painstaking task that could take the entire journey. The continuous intake of coal would ensure the turbines would spin at a constant accelerated pace, not what the Titanic was designed for. It was meant to be a luxurious passenger liner and not for breaking speed records. However, the crew would find enthusiasm in not only acknowledging the Titanic as unsinkable, but also as the fastest. John and his crew continued to shovel the coal into the furnace for several days. The temperature within the bow was becoming hotter every day. The bulkhead's contained heat was so severe that it became weak at the seams in the iron walls and rivets.
2 more days, lads, just 2 more days.
John was laughing, trying to raise the spirits of his mates as they were working tirelessly. But as they were all laughing, joking, and looking forward to dry land, they unknowingly approached their final destination. The Titanic was speeding through the calm sea. Greg looked ahead, above in the lookout tower, keeping a keen eye out as they were in iceberg territory now. Even though the way seemed clear, false horizons could occur, creating confusion about how far objects in the distance truly were. As they were traveling in the Gulf Stream waters into the colder Labrador Current, air columns cooled from the bottom upwards, creating a thermal inversion. This incredibly high air pressure ensured fog wasn't present, providing a deceptively clear outlook. But the thermal inversion can also create optical illusions, showing the horizon further away, appearing higher in the distance, or masking whatever objects that could come before it. These false horizons could easily hide any icebergs that could be approaching. Greg knew the perils of a calm sea in the Arctic, preferring the rough waters, where it's easier to detect icebergs within waves. Peering from the lookout, Greg was looking towards the dark abyss ahead. Suddenly, within 1 mile directly in front, a formidable image quickly emerged from the dark waters surrounding.
Iceberg, right ahead!
Greg yelled to his mate, who quickly called to the helm and directed them to steer hard to starboard. The helmsman received the call. In the heat of the moment, he turned the wheel counterclockwise. He then realized he'd turned the wheel the wrong way and quickly went in the opposite direction. The ship aimed towards the iceberg, veering to the port side whilst reducing speed. Although there was a delay in turning the wheel, since there was a short distance from the signal and the fast pace that they sailed at, it may not have made a difference. As they approached the iceberg, it appeared as though they'd miss it, but over 87% of an iceberg is underwater. And as they came along the side, the hidden ice underneath hit the port side bow, piercing the side of the hull with a 12-square-foot tear. The ship shook, with all aboard aware that something was amiss. Amongst the confusion and fear, they were oblivious of the damage. As they gathered their bearings, 6 out of 16 compartments were quickly filling up with seawater. The hull could only withstand 4 compartments filling before sinking. Time was ticking as the Titanic made its descent into the depths. The weakened bulkhead with heated steel pillars and rivets broke under the pressure and sudden change of temperature from the ice-cold water. The call was made to abandon the ship. Lifeboats were prepared to be released, while help signals were sent out to nearby ships. The radio operator was guiltily sitting, constantly calling out to a nearby ship that had been in contact with the Titanic recently. There was steady communication with this ship over the past few days, providing warnings of icebergs since the Titanic departed from Southampton. The final warning message received was just 1 hour ago. Upon receiving the final warning, the operator ignorantly responded, "Shut up," with the assumption that their warnings of icebergs were pointless. Following this unfortunate response, the ship turned their radio off and provided radio silence. The closest ship that was responding to their distress signals was 500 miles away, too far to provide any assistance in time. There were countless mistakes that caused the Titanic's watery end, whether they contributed directly or from sheer ignorance. The most tragic of them was the number of people aboard the ship, 2,224 of them. There were only enough lifeboats provided to rescue 1,178, barely half of the people.
In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the 4th funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, Large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the 4th was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the suit being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The 2 parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, the crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and his captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest. The Royal Mail Ship, or RMS Titanic, easily the most famous steamship in history, was once the symbol of luxury and dreams that promised to come true. It took 3 years and 3,000 people to construct it. On April 10, 1912, the brand new ocean liner greeted its passengers with the smell of fresh varnish, paint, and newly sawn wood. Back then, they still used lead for the production of paint and linseed oil as a binder, so that smell must have been powerful. When it was fully operational, the giant vessel consumed around 850 tons of coal per day, and the passengers would also smell its fumes. Another odor that must have filled the Titanic's decks, at least the first-class ones, was the new scent by the famous French perfume house Guerlain. It was released earlier in the same year and quickly became a hit with the well-off ladies. The perfume that you can still buy today is a mix of violets and iris with creamy vanilla. On the dramatic evening of April 14th, when Titanic only had hours to live, the unknowing waiters were serving oysters, lamb and mint sauce, roast duck with applesauce, and other delicacies to their first-class guests. The second class was filled with the smells of curried chicken, spring lamb, and roast turkey. Third-class passengers had simple gruel and biscuits that night. At 11 p.m., as the ship got dangerously close to the iceberg, the new smell added to the mix. It was a mineral odor with metallic notes. If you have ice in your fridge, you must have noticed it takes the smell of neighboring foods. The same happens to icebergs. They take on the odors of sea animals and maintain the chemical composition of the water that they're made of. If more people had known about the meaning of this particular metallic smell, they probably still wouldn't have saved the ship. But the number of people that managed to escape to safety could have been larger. Speaking of smells, in case you've ever wondered what space smells like but aren't planning to become an astronaut anytime soon, listen up. You can try out Ode to Space, an aroma that was designed by NASA decades ago. The idea of the perfume was to help astronauts prepare for their encounters with space at all levels during their training. But hold on a second, space is a vacuum, so it technically shouldn't have any smell. Yet, astronauts who have been out there remembered it as a pleasant metallic odor, something like the smell of welding fumes or burnt gunpowder. They could smell it on their spacesuits after coming back into their spacecraft. We can also guess what other planets smell like based on what their atmospheres are made of. Venus has clouds of sulfuric acid in its atmosphere, so it must smell like rotten eggs. Mars and Uranus also smell like rotten eggs, by the way. Each of the layers of Jupiter's atmosphere is made up of different chemicals. That's why it smells different depending on where you are. Some layers would greet you with a yummy aroma of bitter almonds or marzipan, and others, closer to the top, smell like cleaning products. The remaining planets of the solar system are unlikely to have a distinctive scent because they're mostly odorless gases in their atmospheres. As for our natural satellite, the Moon, the Apollo astronauts claim that its dust smells like gunpowder. The fragrance of fresh-cut grass makes regular mowing it nearly worth it. But did you know that the grass isn't having a great time while you're doing it? In fact, it's sort of screaming for help. And because grass can't scream out loud, it expresses discomfort by releasing a mix of smelly, volatile molecules. It does it to protect itself from insects. Caterpillars and other similar creatures just love to munch on sugary plant snacks. When you mow the grass, it releases jasmonic acid, among other things. It's sort of a signal to parasitic wasps that there is a caterpillar available. These creatures deal with the grass's offenders, and it can keep growing happily ever after. From the point of view of the grass, mowing is not much different from an insect attack, so it protects itself the best way it can. The rain has an easy-to-recognize powerful smell, also known as petrichor. But where does it come from? Turns out some plants secrete oils during drought. The rocks and soil accumulate those oils compounds, and when the raindrops hit, they mix with water and release into the air. Sometimes these oils combine with chemicals produced by bacteria living in the soil. The result of this cooperation is a musky odor you can smell in the woods or in your garden when you turn over the wet soil. Ozone also adds to the smell of rain, especially after thunderstorms. It happens when a lightning bolt's electrical charge splits oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere, and they later recombine into ozone. One theory says we enjoy the aroma of rain so much because it's imprinted in our brains. Different cultures have always associated rain with something positive, and we could have inherited that perception. Now, chocolate fans, of which I am one, this is for you. There are flowers that smell exactly like your favorite tree. It's a product of a tropical plant, after all, and since it's impossible to recreate the exact magical scent chocolate has in a perfume, you can plant some chocolate flowers, also known as the green eye lyra leaves, in your garden. These flowers look like daisies with yellow petals around a deep red center. When you pick its petals, the flower releases the delicious smell we all love so much. The leaves and branches of the plant also have the same fragrance. Now, in case I got you interested, you can find the flower in dry soils of Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and other states with similar climates. It blooms all year, and the aroma is strongest on warm days. The bear cat, also known as the biturong, does not only look super cute, but also smells like buttered popcorn. Biturongs prefer to stay alone and use their aroma to mark their territory and find potential partners when they have to. Scientists tried to figure out the secret of their unusual smell and suggested it could come from secretions from the scent glands under the animal's tail. Further research showed that the popcorn smell comes from the bear cat's urine. After the animal answers nature's call, it leaves a scent trail in the trees with its tail that often gets soaked. But if the real popcorn only releases its amazing smell when it's popping under heat, how do bear cats manage to do it without a microwave? Well, the answer could be in their diet, or more likely, in the bacteria that come in contact with the animal's natural fluid. Durian is a fruit popular in Southeast Asia that smells sweet and nice to some people, but to the majority, it's a mix of rotten onions and sweaty socks. The stench is so powerful that it's banned on public transportation and hotels in some countries. The secret of durian is its 44 odor-active components. The mix is so complex that you can never tell what it's going to smell like. And despite that horrible smell, durian is considered a delicacy and is used to make mostly sweet dishes like cakes and candy. There was a smelly incident involving durian at a library in Australia. The smell of rotting fruit in a cupboard has spread across the entire building through the air conditioning system. They mistook it for gas leakage and had to evacuate around 500 students and teachers. Well, that stinks. And finally, if you've ever been to natural hot springs or went to see some geysers, you'll never forget the smell of hydrogen sulfide, or less poetically, rotten eggs. It's actually not only yucky but also highly flammable, but it can also be quite useful. Most households in Iceland use geothermal springs as a source of hot water. Although it doesn't smell fresh, it's perfectly safe to drink, and the smell doesn't stay on your body after you take a shower. So there.
At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic made contact with an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. Many artifacts were found and restored, like parts of the ship, jewelry, and dining plates, to name a few. It took approximately 3 hours for the ship to be completely submerged in the remote icy water. The night was cold and very much alive. The orchestra was playing music as they enchanted the guests on board. Everyone was excited to arrive in America. It was still considered an amazing feat for a ship to cross the Atlantic back in 1912. But as the day went ahead, there was an atmosphere of impending doom for the captain and his crew. No one else felt it though. It seemed to them nothing could possibly go wrong, and this would just be another regular night. To them, the Titanic was unsinkable. The last thing on your mind when thinking about the Titanic is the mail crew. Yes, there were mailmen on board delivering mail to America. It may seem like a pretty mundane occupation, but there was a very tough test to pass in order to be accepted on board. And only a few top candidates would qualify, and those few would get shortlisted and accepted. John Starr March, an American, was one of these mailmen earning between $1,000 to $1,500 a year working on the Titanic. Back in 1912, this was considered to be a lot of money. They were not officially part of the ship's crew, since the mail crew was placed near the third-class quarters. But given their influence and resistance, they were eventually moved and given a private dining area. March got this job since he needed the money to support his family. He found a perfect way to earn some big bucks, working on a large ship traveling across the ocean. He was 51 at the time and came from New Jersey. Sadly, he was on board when the ship sank and didn't make it. But they recovered a pocket watch that gives us a little insight into what happened that fateful evening. It's a gold case engraved with filigree and had a caption saying it was made by the Elgin National Watch Company. On the surface, you'd think this would just make a pretty cool antique sitting over the fireplace, but there are some unusual details about it. There are obvious signs water seeped beneath the glass, and the black arms of the watch indicate the time to be exactly 1:27. It leaves us wondering why the clock stopped at this precise hour. What was the owner doing? The mail clerks were operating a fully functioning and efficient mail sorting facility on board the Titanic. This wasn't something you'd come by often on a cruise ship, since typical ocean liners use closed mail bags to transport the mail from one port to another. But the mail sorting facility on the Titanic allowed passengers to send out postcards whenever the ship docked in transit zones in Ireland and France. According to reports, people started heading back to their rooms at around 11 p.m., but some of them were still hanging around and enjoying their night. The 5 mailmen were celebrating a colleague's birthday in their separate dining room. 5 minutes before impact, crew members spotted the iceberg and rang the bell 3 times as a warning that something was ahead of the ship. They gave orders for the Titanic to move left, or, as they say in the biz, hard a starboard, to make the engines reverse. It was not enough to avoid the great impact. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg, and disaster erupted on the inside. Not just water seeping in and ultimately sinking the ship, but panic and chaos among the passengers and crew members. Captain Smith reached the deck and was informed that the Titanic had hit an iceberg. And at the same time, the mailroom began filling with water. We know that the 880-foot ship was completely submerged at around 2:20 a.m., with 706 survivors. The time between the impact and the sinking was really eventful. At midnight, they started getting the lifeboats ready for the passengers to evacuate. Orders were given for women and children to board the safety boats with some crewmen to guide and operate them. The problem was that the 20 safety boats available could only host 1,178 people out of the total of more than 2,200 passengers on board. March and his colleagues began sorting out the mail. There was chaos in directing and ordering around. With each second passing, icy cold water was filling the ship. 15 minutes after midnight, Captain Smith ordered his crew members to send out a distress signal. Even though SOS was established earlier than the Titanic, many others used CQD. The CQ stands for General Call, and the D is distress. The Frankfurt was too far away to help, even though it was one of the first to respond. Even the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, responded, but it also was too far away. At 12:20 a.m., the Carpathia received the urgent message and redirected from its original course to help them out, even though they were 58 nautical miles away. Although this was some relieving news, the water kept seeping in at an alarming rate. It wasn't easy to keep everyone calm, knowing that the ship could be underwater in a matter of hours. At this point, many passengers were already on board the safety boats, waiting to descend into the water. The musicians on board began playing music for the ones still waiting. At first, they were playing in the first-class lounge, and then they moved to the deck. There's a debate on how long they were playing for and what song it was. None of the musicians made it out. The 5 mailmen on board were also doing their duties while the ship was sinking. According to a ship officer, the mailroom was already covered in water above the ankles, and the mailmen were busy trying to save as much mail as they could. March was one of them. There were bags of mail floating around. They started with the registered mail. Witnesses of the Titanic sinking reported the mailmen were putting bags of mail on the deck to keep them from getting wet until help arrived. They also mentioned bags of mail were floating about in the freezing water. It wasn't until 12:45 a.m. when lifeboat number 7 on the left side of the ship was lowered onto the water. Even though it had room for roughly 65 people, only 27 people were inside. Many of the safety boats carried fewer passengers than their maximum capacity allowed. The crew were worried that the boats would capsize if so many people were on them. Some reports suggest that some people even refused to board the safety ships, sticking with the claim that the Titanic was unsinkable. At the same time, they fired up one of the 8 distress rockets in the air, but it didn't get them any help. At 12:55 a.m., the second and third safety boats were descended to the waters with 2 male passengers jumping on board. 5 minutes later, another safety boat was lowered with around 39 people. At this point, water entered the base of the grand staircase. In the next 20 minutes, more safety boats were lowered, most of them underloaded. Still no help. The Carpathia was still on the way. Panic was growing, and tensions were rising. There was a lot of anger for people being left behind. At around 1:30 a.m., things were getting out of control. The organized boarding of passengers to the safety boats stopped. March's watch stopped 3 minutes earlier, which could mean he was part of the scuffle between crew members and passengers. It took 3 hours for the Carpathia to arrive. March wasn't among the survivors. His watch proved to be one of the essential findings lost in the wreckage of the Titanic. It was eventually returned to March's two daughters, and now it's in one of the collections of the National Postal Museum. March was a man who did what he had to do in the worst circumstances. Time was a precious commodity for the people on board the ship, and this watch proved valuable to learn more about the tragic yet inspiring stories of the Titanic.
It was the biggest ship ever built in its time, and it was supposed to be unsinkable. But within days of steaming out on its first voyage in 1912, the Titanic was gone beneath the relentless waves of the North Atlantic Ocean. And of its more than 2,200 passengers and crew, only 706 survived that dreadful night. Would a smaller ship have fared any better in the same situation? Did the size of the iceberg truly matter in the end? Was it a mistake for the ship to change course at the last minute as it tried to avoid impact? These are three questions that have people pondering, what if? We do know that Titanic was considered an engineering marvel in its day. Designed by Thomas Andrews for the British shipping company White Star Line, it was just over 880 feet long and 175 feet tall. Built with abundant space for 840 staterooms, a swimming pool, a squash court, a gym, and 2 dining rooms. But it was below deck that one of its most impressive new features could be found. Titanic's hull was divided into 16 compartments designed to be watertight. Up to 4 of these compartments could take on water in the event of a breach, with the remaining 12 helping to keep the damaged ship afloat. It was thanks to these compartments that the ship was regarded as unsinkable. Rumor has it that Philip Frank, White Star Line's vice president, even declared, "There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." On April 14, 1912, that proved to be mistaken when Titanic struck an iceberg. As ice ripped along the ship's hull, several of those watertight compartments ruptured. It took only 2.5 hours for Titanic to sink. Did the size of the iceberg that hit Titanic seal its fate? Would a bigger or smaller iceberg have made any difference? Icebergs come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. They are pieces of ice that have broken away from glaciers or ice shelves in the Arctic and Antarctic, and are now wandering across the ocean until they eventually melt. One of the tallest icebergs ever found would have easily dwarfed Titanic. Discovered in 1957, it was 550 feet high. That's close to the height of the Washington Monument. Imagine ramming into something that big. Smaller icebergs, though, can turn out just as dangerous. Some are the size of houses and called bergy bits. Others, closer to the size of a car, are called growlers. These can be much harder for ships and boats to locate, making them more difficult to avoid. And though smaller, they can produce a lot of damage when hit. It's also critical to recall that icebergs are always bigger than they seem, with the majority of their mass lurking below the ocean surface. In fact, over 80% of an iceberg's volume is underwater. Most of its sharp, jagged edges cannot be seen. Roam too close, and you risk damaging your ship's hull. Because Titanic had little notice of its impending doom, a smaller iceberg, struck at the same angle, could still have been enough to bring that mighty ship down. Now, it's possible that had the iceberg been larger, it would have been spotted sooner. Titanic might have had time to alter course and avoid the impact. But missing that one iceberg would not have guaranteed Titanic's safety. It was traveling in a dangerous stretch of the Atlantic called Iceberg Alley. It's located 250 miles east and southeast of Newfoundland, Canada. Behind one iceberg, there could be another, and another after that. And so the crew on board had to remain very attentive to avoid several potential collisions, not just one. A smaller ship might have been better suited for the trip. Titanic's size was certainly a challenge when it came to steering. In fact, it had just left her dock in Southampton when it nearly collided with another smaller ocean liner, the SS New York, missing it by just 2 feet. The gigantic steamship was obviously not made for maneuvering quickly in tight quarters. A ship that size required time and space to change course. But when it comes to ships versus icebergs, a ship's size doesn't always matter. The Islander was a steamship designed to travel the Inside Passage in Alaska. In the summer of 1901, it struck an iceberg, which tore a hole in the front portion or bow of the ship. The vessel did not sink right away, and the crew tried to steer it to safety. Ultimately, its bow completely submerged, and its stern was lifted up and out of the water. It didn't take much longer before the ship sank completely. Of the 168 passengers and crew members, 128 survived, and $3 million in gold was lost. Islander had a 240-foot hull, making it almost a quarter of the size of Titanic, and that smaller size didn't seem to be much help in preventing a collision with an iceberg. And then there was the Hans Hedtoft in 1959. Also known as the Little Titanic or the Danish Titanic, it was referred to as the safest ship afloat. It was 272 feet long with 95 people on board. Much like the real Titanic, the Hans Hedtoft was specifically engineered to handle most of what the sea could throw its way. Along with its double steel bottom, it also had an armored bow and 7 watertight compartments. How could such a ship sink? But it could, and it did. It was on its first voyage, returning to Copenhagen, when it ran into trouble. On January 30th, it hit an iceberg. An SOS was sent, but when the Johannes Cross arrived to help, the Hans Hedtoft was nowhere to be found. The only evidence of the ship's existence was a lifebelt that was washed ashore in Iceland 9 months later. Again, the ship's smaller size didn't work in its favor. A smaller size of Titanic wouldn't have guaranteed a safe voyage in 1912. The final what-if concerns the last-minute choice when the iceberg was spotted and the alarm sounded. First, Titanic could attempt a complete stop, but this wasn't an option as the ship needed a half a mile to come to a halt, and the iceberg was a mere 900 feet away. Second, the Titanic could attempt to avoid the iceberg by steering away from it. This is what the captain ordered, but the attempt was unsuccessful, resulting in a deep gash across the ship's hull. The final option? To hit the iceberg head-on. Would this have made any difference? The answer is an intriguing maybe. Some think a head-on collision would have saved Titanic. In this scenario, the collision would have limited the damage to the very front of the ship. Instead of the iceberg tearing through the hull and compromising several of the watertight compartments, only 4 of the compartments would have been breached. This meant the others could do their job of keeping Titanic afloat. The ship could be stuck, unable to move, but it would remain above water until help arrived. This would provide a ship like Carpathia enough time to reach the scene of the accident and bring the people on board to safety. One of the Titanic's designers, Edward Wilding, made a similar claim during an inquiry into the sinking. He argued that most people would have survived a head-on crash, and that Titanic itself would not have sunk. Others disagree, though. First, the special bulkheads on Titanic were designed specifically to protect the ship against collisions with other vessels, not with icebergs. These compartments would crumple upon impact, absorbing some of the force while the other ship absorbed the rest. Though the damage would still be extensive, the remaining bulkheads would keep the ship afloat. But an iceberg does not have the same flex in a collision as you would experience with another ship. Most of the force would be absorbed by Titanic, resulting in greater damage to the ship. Even worse, the impact would be carried through the full length of the ship. Rivets would burst, seams would tear, the compartments would quickly flood, and the ship would sink even faster, resulting in fewer survivors. In any case, as with most what-ifs, we'll never really know the answer. As tragic as Titanic's first and last voyage was, it did result in changes that helped make venturing out to sea much safer. Findings from hearings on the disaster led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, or ICC, in 1914. an organization that tracks icebergs in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans to ensure vessels in the area can avoid them. In the US and Britain, ships were obligated to carry enough lifeboats to accommodate every person aboard. Regular lifeboat drills were made mandatory. And finally, the bulkheads on ships were made higher to keep water out, and bottoms were stretched to create double hulls, helping make the compartments truly waterproof. There's no denying that Titanic was a terrible tragedy, but the lessons learned from that night to remember has helped prevent many more.
"I'll never let go, Jack. I'll never let go," said Rose. Then she did let go, and the whole movie theater burst into tears. It happened when Titanic came out in 1997. Alright, who am I kidding? It's really hard not to cry when you watch this scene for the 10th, 20th, and 50th time almost 30 years later. But did this great love story happen in real life? Or did James Cameron just invent it for some good drama? As much as I don't want to disappoint you, Jack and Rose never fell in love on board the real Titanic. There was a real Jay Dawson on the luxurious ocean liner, but he was a crew member, and his full name was Joseph. The real-life inspiration for Rose was the American artist Beatrice Wood. James Cameron came across her biography while he was working on the first draft of the script and decided to bring her love for art and family background into the story. It doesn't mean that the movie is completely off when it comes to historical accuracy, though. The unsinkable ship that sank departed from Southampton, England to New York and was 400 miles south of Newfoundland on April 14th when crew members noticed the iceberg. The contact with it lasted 37 seconds, precisely as long as the corresponding scene in the movie. Remember this guy, Thomas Andrews, who was wandering around with a small notebook and pencil? He was the real ship designer. Andrews was quite talented at what he did, and had worked on many successful projects before the Titanic. He would normally travel on the ships he designed during the maiden voyage to make sure everything was going smoothly. He boarded the Titanic as one of the first-class passengers and was taking notes all the time. After the unfortunate rendezvous with an iceberg, Andrews was seen inspecting the flooded parts of the ship with Captain Smith. According to his sad forecast, the Titanic would have gone down in about 2 hours. One of the stewards claimed that he had seen Thomas Andrews moments before the sinking. He chose not to leave the Titanic and didn't put on his lifebelt. No one had seen him ever since. Another memorable moment from the movie is a boy playing on one of the decks with his spinning top. This was an accurate recreation of a real photo that was taken on board the Titanic on April 11, 1912. The passengers in the photo are first-class passengers Frederick Spedden and his 6-year-old son Douglas. The family was going back home to America after traveling around Algeria. When the evacuation of passengers began, Spedden's nurse told him they were going to see the stars. They say he had successfully slept through the entire drama and woke up safe and sound in a lifeboat the following morning. His father had also survived the sinking. Sadly, an automobile accident took the life of Douglas just 3 years later. One of Titanic's most charismatic ladies, both on the screen and in real life, got her nickname Unsinkable Molly Brown for a good reason. Several witnesses remembered she was, indeed, trying to persuade others in her lifeboat to go back and save more lives, just like in that heartbreaking scene from the movie. When Carpathia came to the rescue of the surviving Titanic passengers, Margaret Brown was helping lower-class survivors and involved her fellow first-class passengers in the process. Once they all got on solid ground, Brown organized a survivors committee. She awarded the captain of the Carpathia for rescuing so many people and was really upset she hadn't been allowed to testify at the Titanic hearings because she was a woman. You won't see any fumes above the fourth pipe of the ship in the movie. It's not a technical mistake. The Titanic, indeed, had it only for more impressive looks and didn't really need that pipe. Back in 1911, the year before our hero's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the 4th was added for balance. They thought the public would have been disappointed to only see 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The movie had an impressive budget, $200 million, but even that wasn't enough to cover all the possible costs. Cameron knew they had to save some money, so they built the replica of the liner only on the starboard, which means the right side. They chose this side to make things look more realistic. The wind at the filming location was moving mostly from north to south, so with the fumes going out, it looked like the liner was actually moving through the ocean. But if you remember one of the first scenes with the Titanic departing from Southampton and people waving, you'll understand why the crew had a problem with it. The real ship was docked at the port, or left side, there. They found a brilliant solution and just flipped the scene horizontally to make it look real. The letters and buttons on costumes were reversed, and actors walked in the opposite direction for everything to be changed in post-production. One of the scenes I can't watch without tears is the elderly couple holding on to each other as they go down with the Titanic. The couple who inspired this heartbreaking episode were real people, some of the richest passengers of the not-so-unsinkable ship. They were Isidore and Ida Strauss, and they owned Macy's. When news of the disaster spread, they put on life jackets and ran to the decks along with others. Ida stepped onto the lifeboat, but Isidore refused to do so before all the ladies and little ones were there. Ida didn't want to leave her husband. She climbed out of the lifeboat and handed her mink coat to her maid, saying she would no longer need it. Isidore wrapped his arms around Ida, and they remained on the bridge of the ship until a huge wave swept them both into the sea. So the bed scene wasn't that accurate, and James Cameron later admitted he had taken some license as a director. You know this guy who was drinking from a flask next to the main characters as the ship was going down? His name was Charles Jugan from England, and he was in charge of 10 bakers, 2 confectioners, and a Vienna baker aboard. He was expecting to earn a real lump sum, and would have been one of the best-paid crew members if everything had gone well. The night the iceberg hit, Joe Hin was off duty, taking a rest in his bunk. He immediately woke up and sent his bakers to deliver bread to lifeboats. He then returned to his room for a drink. Once he came back on the deck, he helped others get in his assigned lifeboat. There was no more room for Charles inside, so he ended up on the outside of the rails of the ship. Finally, when the Titanic submerged, he just swam away, and as the sun rose again, he found one of the lifeboats and was rescued by Carpathia. The contents of the flask must have helped him survive. The well-dressed man who decided to stay on the Titanic forever was American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim. That last name probably sounds familiar, and yes, he was from that famous family. Guggenheim was traveling with his valet, his significant other, a singer from France called Leontine, her maid, and their chauffeur. They all boarded the Titanic in France during one of the short stops it made after leaving Southampton. When disaster struck, Benjamin was helping the ladies get in their lifeboat. He reportedly said they were only saying goodbye till the next day. He was sure the ship would be quickly repaired. After helping many women and youngsters get in the boats, Guggenheim chose not to fight over the remaining seats. He and his valet returned from the decks to their first-class suite and put on their finest suits to go down like gentlemen.
No one could ever have imagined that the unsinkable Titanic would collide with an iceberg, except for one man, William Thomas Stead. Well, not directly, of course. It's not like he jolted out of bed one day, envisioning the fall of the Titanic. Rather, he wrote an empowering short story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor on March 3, 1886, 26 years before Titanic sank. Okay, let's do a super quick recap. Titanic was traveling from Southampton to New York in April 1912 in the North Atlantic. The ship hit an iceberg, and less than 3 hours later, it was completely underwater. Out of 2,208 people on board, just 706 survived due to the limited number of lifeboats and icy cold water. Another passenger ship, Carpathia, heard the distress call, picked up the survivors, and brought them safely to New York. The short story William Stead wrote was about Thomas, a British sailor, who got on a passenger liner bound for the U.S. At one point, the protagonist realized there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board the ship in case something happened. A couple of days later, heavy fog covered everything in sight. Luck was not on the liner's side, and it collided with a stray ship, just like Titanic struck an iceberg. Only 200 out of the 916 people made it safely to the U.S. The main character managed to survive by jumping into the water and climbing into one of the lifeboats. Now, you'd think that the story riled up everyone in the industry to add extra lifeboats on ships. But sadly, it received very little attention when it was published. Even more tragically, William Thomas Stead was on Titanic when it sank, and he didn't make it. The survivors who knew Stead mentioned that he had always been cheerful and had loved to chat during meals. He complimented the ship's design and how sturdy it was. Witnesses also talked about how he had been helpful when the ship had been sinking, having given his life jacket to someone else. He was a journalist by profession and was on his way to New York for a ceremony. One of his most important contributions to modern journalism was the use of illustrations in every newspaper article. He also introduced newspaper interviews, and they're still used to this day along with illustrations. But this story wasn't the only published work that predicted the disaster. Morgan Robertson was an author and former ship captain who wrote short stories and novels. His most notable novella is The Wreck of the Titan. It's also known as Futility. The book was written in 1898, 14 years before Titanic. It was a fictional story about the Titan, an ocean liner similar to Titanic, which was crossing the North Atlantic. It's also a coincidence that Titan was just as fast as Titanic and shared many other similarities, like size and design. The book described it as unsinkable and the largest ship to hit the ocean at the time. That's what they said about Titanic, too. Another eerie similarity was the limited number of lifeboats it had. The story took place in April, and that's when Titanic set off on its journey and hit the iceberg. The Titan story also mentioned that barely anyone had survived that horrible accident. Unlike Stead's story, the protagonist of Robertson took a different path. The Titan sinking happened somewhere halfway through the book, so after the accident, the main character went on with his life. The book was brought back into the spotlight after the Titanic disaster. How could someone describe the events that took place almost a decade later so accurately? Many started to believe Robertson could see the future. But the reality was that Robertson knew his way around a ship. It was easy for him to write down the nitty-gritty of things without doing more research. Realistically, one of the biggest threats for ships at that time was hitting an iceberg or colliding with other ships. The next story sounds somewhat mysterious. Once, Alex Mackenzie heard a voice that warned him not to board Titanic. But when he turned around, there was nobody there. As he continued walking, the voice spoke to him again. But this time, it was louder and more distinct. He took the warning seriously and decided to cancel the trip and go back to Glasgow, Scotland, his hometown. His grandparents weren't too happy to find him back home instead of on Titanic. After all, the ticket was very expensive. That disappointment very soon disappeared when they heard that the ship had struck an iceberg. John Coffey was a member of the crew of Titanic, but he decided to ditch the ride when the ship stopped at his hometown in Queenstown, Ireland. His inner voice told him to get off the liner, and he did. He was only 23 at the time, and for someone his age, it could be a major career boost and an opportunity to grow. Despite the horrible tragedy, the guy signed to work with the RMS Mauritania just months after the Titanic sinking. Talk about commitment. Some added info was revealed about what may have contributed to the fall of Titanic. The constructors insisted that the ship was unsinkable, but many people later theorized that the vessel's steel plates had been too frail for the freezing Atlantic water. It may have caused the rivets to pop, allowing ocean water to seep inside. Another theory is that there may have been a fire in the hull of the Titanic that had been raging for 3 weeks before the voyage. The fire softened the steel, allowing the iceberg to cut through it like a hot knife through butter. Some pictures before the ship set off on its journey show black marks on the hull, which could have been caused by fire. Either way, the iceberg would have caused significant damage in any case, no matter if there was a fire or not. Some people also blame those who designed the Titanic. The ship was built with large joints at the bottom, which probably snapped easily during the collision. Of course, these are all theories, but we know for a fact that the iceberg was the main character of this drama, and that the works of Stead and Robertson should have been taken seriously. Either way, this should be a lesson for the future, helping to prevent similar tragic accidents. By the way, ocean liners and passenger ships wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, he invented a steam engine that was so strong it could produce enough energy to power a ship. And a century later, in 1819, the first steamship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, UK. It only took the vessel 29 days to cross the ocean. The passenger ship industry boomed in the early 1900s when it became easier for people to move to America or go on holidays. As decades rolled by, the use of aircraft stole the spotlight from passenger ships since planes were faster and more efficient. Nowadays, it's quite rare for a passenger ship to collide with anything in open water. Modern technologies can detect anything that can pose a threat and even predict stormy weather. Cruise ships these days are giants compared to the vessels of Titanic's era. Modern ships can carry almost twice the number of passengers and have amenities folks back then could only dream of. Most cruise ships these days have several restaurants to choose from, multiple swimming pools, and game rooms to catch a break. If you're in the mood for some fun, you can watch live performances. Don't forget about the helicopter pad, because why not? Don't worry if you start feeling unwell. The in-house doctors are always there to help any passenger in need. And these ships are only going to get bigger. Putting Titanic and a modern cruise ship side by side is like comparing a Corgi to a Doberman. Back then, Titanic was the biggest and most cutting-edge vessel anyone could dream of. So, who knows what the future of cruise ships can hold? We might even have entire cities floating around. That would be a really big boat.
We know Titanic from so many stories, even a movie, but now we have its first full-sized digital scan. And nope, it's not like those models from before, where we mostly imagined what the ship was supposed to be like. This time we got a real digital scan. A team of experts really mapped the deep-sea floor around the Titanic together with the ship itself. We basically got a 3D view of the entire wreck, which is like going deep down beneath the ocean's surface and seeing Titanic as if all the water has been drained away. So, the story of the wreck started in 1985, 73 years after the Titanic went down. The explorer named Robert Ballard stumbled upon it somewhere between two submarines that also went down in that area. He was actually on a different task back then, so he didn't even have time to explore the ship properly. But as he was searching for the submarines, he realized how ocean currents affect sinking debris. He noticed the heaviest object sank quickly and left a trail of debris behind, the trail that followed the currents. Using this knowledge, Ballard made a hypothesis the Titanic had broken in two and left a debris trail as it sank. Before he found the wreck, everyone thought the ship just went down in one piece after hitting an iceberg. So everyone knew where the ship was so the adventure could start, or not. It was hard to explore it. The ship is enormous, and the dark depths of the ocean make it really difficult to capture its whole body in one go. So we mostly relied on glimpses of the decaying ship, and had to settle with teasing scattered parts of the whole picture and filling it up with speculations and stories. But in the summer of 2022, we finally got something different. A team of experts from Magellan Loaded, a company specializing in mapping the deep sea, teamed up with Atlantic Productions, who were making a documentary about the project. They embarked on a mission to capture the complete view of the Titanic. They used submersibles. Those are vehicles that go underwater, remotely controlled by a team of skilled explorers. These submersibles dove deep into the ocean. It wasn't an easy job. They spent over 200 hours collecting information about the entire length and breadth of the wreck. It was like a real-life treasure hunt. But instead of finding gold and jewels, they took something even more precious. Over 700,000 images of the Titanic from every angle possible. Yup, they took photos of every tiny part of the ship, even the not-so-interesting bits most of us would usually skip. Even mapping the muddy parts was an important part, because it helped fill in the gaps between the more exciting things they discovered. And this was a way for all of us to finally get a detailed 3D reconstruction. Even though it's been more than 100 years, you can still recognize the bow of the Titanic, covered in rust that hangs down like stalactites. On top of the bow is the boat deck, where a big hole gives us a glimpse into the empty space where the grand staircase once stood, like a window into the ship's glamorous past. Its stern is now a wild mess of twisted metal. As the Titanic went down, this part collapsed and spiraled into the seabed. The bow and the stern ended up separated by about 2,600 feet. There's a vast field of debris surrounding this giant, stuck on the seafloor. This debris is like a scattered treasure trove, full of intricate metalwork from the ship, statues, and even unopened champagne bottles. There are also personal belongings that went down together with the ship, like dozens of shoes resting across the seafloor. It was a tough task to do, go down and take all those pictures. It may not sound that hard at first, considering it was the vehicle that really immersed itself into such deep parts of the ocean, not the people. But studying the ocean is hard. We haven't explored, mapped, or even seen over 80% of it. The conditions are harsh, and the pressure becomes more intense the deeper you go. And their vehicle had to dive down to nearly 13,120 feet below the surface. That's like 12 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other. Plus, you have strong currents in that area, so it was probably like trying to navigate through a watery maze. And submersibles weren't supposed to touch anything. Even the slightest wrong step can damage the wreck that was already so fragile. It seems like the Titanic is frozen in time, so it will always be there waiting for us. But in reality, it's slowly disappearing. It's pretty obvious that the ocean water ruined it considering how long it has been down there. But it's not just that. The wreck itself has become a home for a specific type of bacteria Halomonas titanicae that even got named after the famous ship. These bacteria have a special ability. They can survive inside rusty formations known as rusticles. They kind of look like icicles, those spikes of ice that form when water falls from something and freezes. These bacteria have a taste for iron, which is abundant in the ship's hull. For them, it's like a real buffet down there. And as time goes by, these bacteria will keep eating away at the iron in the ship, bit by bit, until one day the feast comes to an end and the whole ship is gone. It's like a slow but steady recycling process. So this 3D model we got because of the hardworking team and technology comes at the best time because we never know how much time we have left with exploring the famous wreck. This time we might even understand the collision with the iceberg better. You know how movies always show the Titanic hitting the iceberg on its right side? Well, we can't even be certain about that. The scans could help us figure out if the ship actually grounded on the iceberg, like getting stuck on it. We can study the stern and analyze how the Titanic struck the seafloor. That will also help us understand what really happened during the sinking. Maybe we'll get a chance to discover if there was really a strong fire that sealed the fate of the Titanic. One theory says that the coal fire had been raging for a whole 3 weeks before the ship even took its first and last trip. And this could have made its hull weaker, which means most of the work was done. The iceberg just delivered the final blow, if there even was an iceberg, as some people wonder. There's an alternative theory they suggested where the Titanic may have actually hit a hidden mass of pack ice instead of a typical iceberg. Pack ice is made up of large sheets of ice that float near the ocean's surface and can be difficult to spot. They believe this pack ice might have drifted into the Atlantic from the Arctic Ocean. According to one professional mariner, Captain L.M. Collins, that stands up with that idea. If the Titanic had struck a regular iceberg, the ship would have sunk much more quickly than it did. And since the Titanic managed to stay on the surface for a relatively long period of time, less than 3 hours, maybe this was a different type of collision. The mariner also said there are differences in what people said they saw when the Titanic sank. He thinks these differences might be because of optical illusions. In this case, when people were looking at the ocean that night, the way the light was reflecting and the conditions at sea might have made things appear closer or distorted. So when they saw something in the water, it might not have been exactly what they thought it was. Whether it was an iceberg or something else. Binoculars might have helped the crew members to spot the potential danger, but unfortunately, they didn't have any. It appears they were locked inside a cabinet, and no one knew where the key was. Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but not many people know that Titanic had 2 sister ships, and that on the night of its sinking, one of them was rushing to help but didn't make it in time. Bad luck seemed to follow the trio of ships, but each one of them had glorious moments that live in the minds of those who sailed in them. Keep on watching to discover a story of awe, ingenuity, and ill fate. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn notifications on to join us on the bright side of life. You know how the iceberg hit the Titanic, how the band played to the end, and how the whole tragedy unfolded, but before it happened, it would have seemed an impossibility for such a ship to meet the end it did. None of that could have been foreseen by White Star Line, the company who built the Titanic, who had high hopes for what the unsinkable ship and its sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, would accomplish. The Olympic was the first of the trio to make sail on June 11, 1911, heading towards New York. The sheer size of it would wow the crowds. The Olympic's maiden voyage went without incident, and a crowd of 8,000 people in New York got to explore its luxurious accommodations while it was docked there. There were high expectations for the massive ship, but just around 2 months later, the Olympic crashed with the HMS Hawke. The Hawke got the brunt of the damage, as the bow was left flat as a pancake. After the crash, the Olympic made its way slowly back to Belfast, where the Titanic was being constructed. On the dock, people could see the two enormous ships side by side, as parts of the Titanic were used to put the Olympic back in shape. A rare sight to behold. And on April 14, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and minutes later, the crew radioed nearby ships for help. That night, the Olympic was returning from New York when it received the distress signal. The ship turned around and rushed at full speed towards the Titanic, but they were so far away that they would have arrived next night. At some point during the early hours of April 15, 1912, the crew of the Olympic decided they wouldn't make it in time and stopped course. The survivors of the Titanic were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. Olympic was set up with lifeboats for all crew and passengers after the Titanic sank. It went from having 20 lifeboats to 64. Changes were also made to the watertight bulkheads, and an extra hull to construct a type of double hull was installed. It was determined that a double hull would have kept the Titanic from sinking. For several years, Olympic was used in the war effort against Germany. Throughout the years, Olympic carried over 200,000 passengers, which included thousands of Americans fleeing from Europe and troops battling during World War I. One of the most significant moments for this ship was when it struck a German submarine and sank it. It was discovered that the submarine was preparing to fire a torpedo on the Olympic before Olympic rammed it. The Olympic ended up sailing the seas for 3 decades, which earned her the nickname of the Old Reliable, despite some previous accidents. It went on to help the survivors on the HMS Audacious when it was sinking, and do what it couldn't for its sister,